Chapter 1. A Dream. The city life was always full of lights. The night sky is blanketed by a shade of clouds and dust. Winston Heath stood atop a building, a cover of metal fibers above him. It was constantly raining in this city, perhaps an attempt at washing away the corruption and filth that accumulated for years. The city called out to him like a cheap escort. It did not want him, but it needed him. A damp and despondent feeling crept up the environment like a fluttering flame slowly burning away at a forest. Winston sighed, his sleeping robes feeling especially cold today. He quietly gazed at the rainy sky and the wide array of roads below. The hundreds of lights moving about the city gave him a restless feeling. He slowly twirled the glass of wine he held in his hands and gazed back towards the bedroom. Among the mattresses, a gorgeous woman of German descent slept quietly, her smooth hair sprawled all over. Winston's gaze was one of melancholy and solitude. With a sigh, he gulped down the wine and kept the glass aside on a table. Eddies of wind swept past him, prompting him to cover his body further with his robes. Blowing out a breath of warm air, he walked back into the room. This was the life of Winston Heath, a top-tier theoretical physicist and an MIT graduate in engineering. There was very little time he had for himself where he could silently ponder and contemplate about his life. Most of his nights were accompanied by beautiful women of all kinds. His net worth was well over $1 billion. He led humanity on one of the most important projects of interstellar travel and also on particle physics. It would not be wrong to say that it was the life of a dream, something anyone would wish for. However, there was always a creeping feeling at the back of his mind, a profound sense of loneliness and isolation. Even when he was surrounded by colleagues, or when he was making love to various women, it was something always on the back of his mind. A cold sensation up his spine that he couldn't take care of, an itch on his body he couldn't scratch. He was surrounded by all, but truly known by none. An old man on a lighthouse shines the light, guiding explorers of the crashing waves. Sailors gratefully regard his presence, but no one ever stops or stays. Without the light, many would perish, yet, here he spends his days with no one to cherish. With a sigh, he took off his robes and climbed back into the bed. The gorgeous woman stirred up in the bed, wrapping her arms around his well-built figure. With a small smile at her antics, the man closed his eyes and drifted off into sleep. A large expanse of a rainforest was before him. The tiny droplets that made their way to the bottom, through the dense canopy made for a light drizzle on his skin. Winston closed his eyes, feeling the sensation of water pouring over him. He looked in front of himself as he stood over a large cliffside. The gigantic forest extended on towards the distant horizon, the dark clouds bellowing above it all. The rain poured down with a light intensity. Mountains arose in the distance, with the forests covering a large part of them. Rivers and lakes littered the landscape, painting a beautiful picture of nature. The smell of wet soil, the soft feeling of droplets on his skin and the breathtaking view, it invited a smile to his face. It felt so refreshing. Even thought it was only a dream, Winston reveled in it. Ads by Pub Future. He sat down on a nearly stone, his naked figure getting wetter and wetter in the drizzle. The humid air was not hard to breathe, and the chirping of birds behind him alleviated his stress. Pitter-patter. Some time passed in stillness. Just then, a small book appeared before Winston. The book floated up into the air. Winston widened his eyes at the display. He was surprised. He was a very accomplished lucid dreamer, able to make all kinds of things in his dreams. It was one of the things that led to his success. Visualization of his goals was the key. However, this was the first time since he mastered lucid dreaming that something he did not intend for had happened. Without his will, the book opened up before him. The slightly yellowish paper appeared old and damp. It was completely devoid of any letters or information. Just then, letters started to appear on the book. You have 3 spin chances. Beginner's luck has been activated. Your luck will be enhanced. Winston looked on in confusion. Spin chances? His inner thoughts somewhat echoed in the surroundings. Spin. As his words fell, a small wheel materialized onto the book pages and began to spin. It spun for about 10 seconds before coming to a stop. When it stopped, the wheel disappeared and a vial with a rainbow fluid appeared. Congratulations! You have gained, Lord of the Mysteries, 3 pathways. And what would this be? He thought in interest. As if answering to his inquiry, more letter appeared on the book. Lord of Mysteries, 3 pathways. you get access to the abilities of the 3 pathways of the Lord of Mysteries: the Fool, the Error, and the Door. You gain the ability to ascend to godhood. Through meticulous acting, you can ascend from sequence 9 to sequence 0 and beyond, simultaneously on each pathway. That seems overpowered. As someone that read a lot of pieces of fiction when he was about 19, Winston was somewhat knowledgeable about these things. Sequence pathways from the franchise Lord of Mysteries was one of them. Having all the abilities from the 3 pathways of Lord of Mysteries. It's overpowered for sure, he thought as he read the entire thing again for good measure. He had read the first book of the Mysteries series from Cuttlefish in his free time. It was, in essence, one of the greatest pieces of fiction ever written in his eyes. At least in terms of web novels. I wonder how stressed I am, to be unconsciously materializing such things in my dream. Winston gave a self-deprecating laugh. Extending his hand, he touched the small vial diagram on the book. A bright light that seemed to be made of 1,000 colors suddenly flashed, and the same vial materialized before him. Winston's reflexes kicked in as he hurriedly took a hold of the vial before it could fall. Ads by Pub Future. Now let's see, he said as he inspected the vial from all angles. I'm supposed to drink this, right? He thought as he removed the cap and poured the contents into his mouth. He had expected the fluid to have some sort of taste. However, there was only a slightly cool sensation on his tongue. Well, can't be hoping this much from a dream, he thought, and once again looked at the book. You have successfully consumed and assimilated the triple pathway sequence 9. Potion of Lord of Mysteries. Congratulations! You are now a seer, an apprentice, and a marauder. Your soul had been made anew. You have 2 spin chances. That oddly seems like something I would really like as a teenager, Winston muttered under his breath. Remembering the type of material he used to read and the type of fantasies he used to have as a teen, a small smile appeared on his face. I was so immature back then. Always thinking of impossible stuff like second chances. He laughed heartily, although his expression was one of melancholy and sadness. Spin. The wheel on the book began to spin once again. This time, after it stopped, an image of a golden monkey-like human came into view. Congratulations! You have gained Instinctual Fighter. Winston touched the image of the human, which made it disappear. He held his chin in contemplation. N/O/vel/B/JN.C//OM. What is this supposed to be? Just like before, a description of the reward came into view. Instinctive Fighter. You are naturally adept at fighting. Combat and ways of martial arts come naturally to you. Through proper training and years of experience, martial arts can be copied through sight alone. Ads by Pub Future. Heightened resistance to stress and diseases. From the description it was clear that the second reward was also very, very powerful. It wasn't anything that his first reward wouldn't allow him to achieve, but just a great starting buff. His first reward was something that would take time to accumulate strength after all. This would have helped me in my wandering years. You have 1 spin chance. Spin. The wheel once again began to spin. This time, as it stopped, the image of a perfectly smooth sphere appeared on the book. Congratulations! You have gained Spherical Soul Crest. Spherical Soul Crest, a spherical crest that resides in the soul. Converts the soul into a perpetual motion machine that it always in a state of inequilibrium. The soul will never reach a state of equilibrium, making the soul effectively immortal. Winston marveled at his luck. Wow, any one of these things would propel any person to the top of the world. He spoke happily. What a weird dream. The book continued to float in front of him mysteriously. Looking at it for a moment, Winston Heath decided to stop dreaming for now and wake up. Closing his eyes, he simulated the sensation of falling. And then, darkness overtook him. The next day was one of transcendental surprise and sorrow. For one of the greatest minds of the human race, one of the most intelligent and qualified theoretical physicists, had been found dead in his bedroom. The post-mortem reports say he died mysteriously, without any ailment, disease, or physiological disorder. The death day of Winston Heath was triggered a worldwide movement of sadness in the populace. Chapter 2. A new sensation. Winston Heath. See the childlike state of a grown man, one that would propel his species to the stars, a gift that he himself could never hope to get. He lights the fire in the scullery, shedding light onto the outside fields, torn and covered with rags of snow and dirt, beyond which stand tall redwood trees that harbor a last few wolves. His eyes travel to the sorry figure of his father, a man supposed to be a teacher, yet one that failed to teach his son anything. He cannot read and he cannot write. Every day he carries farming tools to the fields to plow incessantly the ground, through which the final grain could land onto his plate. 12 years ago, his mother had passed. The virtuous woman who had spent 9 months protecting in her own bosom the one that would chase her off was reduced to nothing more than a spectral figure in his mind. The father does not say her name, the child does not know it. He has an older brother to name, one that ran off with a rich old lass that whispered seductive promises of glory and money into his ears. His own figure is thin and malnourished, his cheekbones protrude out and the ribs are visible. The father does nothing. At 13 he runs away, his mind harboring a taste of violence that will get him through. He boards a boat that travels at night with bulbs alight, seemingly entire cities afloat on an insurmountable body of water, carrying lost souls to their final rest. He sits among the people, all diffident in their own respects. He gets into a fist fight at the back of the deck and leaves his opponent in a pool of blood. For the first time in a long while, his pockets are not yet empty. The ship breaks off the float and he gets to the ground. The money and power he holds in the weight of his fist is intoxicating. Cheap whores call him out. He gives in. At 13, he gets the first touch of a woman, one he paid more to do just that than what he would earn working for an entire month. He drinks a bottle of beer and lies at the edge of the street. A year goes by. The child has grown into a dangerous boy, his fists are big and the arms have picked up meat. His reputation precedes him in these parts as does the fear of his name. The authorities deal with him, he goes away. Then again they do, he moves. A vicious cycle. Traveling at the ships earns him greatly. In the day he sings and rests, trying to learn the languages and the art of reading and writing. At night, he descends like a fairytale beast, fists swinging, ready to take life for the money or have his taken. The boy becomes 15, and an old man meets him at the docks. His face is a mosaic of wrinkles that run from everywhere to everywhere. Just yesterday, the boy had been shot in the back by a sailor. The old man takes him in. On the cot, Winston lays. The old man speaks. Your name? Winston. Adds by pub future no last name. None that I'm aware of. Then you got a problem taking mine. Winston stares at him expressionlessly. Heath. Call yourself Winston Heath from now on. The old man pishes his nose slightly. His face was a blend of the warmest colors Winston had ever encountered. Why are you wandering around like this? I have nothing else to do. Have any experience of study? I do. You do. Sometimes. I know how to read now. Winston smiles. The old man smiles back. Then I guess you'll be under my care from now on. That was the instance that changed Winston's fate, that would otherwise have him prowling like a deranged beast in the shipping docks like a starved tiger would in the woods, had been changed to something far more. However, as much as he despised the past of his, it taught him an important lesson. Violence endures. He speaks. Winston jolts awake, his entire upper body naked while his underside is covered by nothing but an underwear. His built body lies along the stone-cold ground, the dirt getting into his hair and dyeing his fair skin. He gets up and looks around. All around him is a large cave, there is nothing else that could be described. It was dark, yet somehow he was able to see. Suddenly, a stream of information flooded into his brain. It was the 3 Sequence 9 potions, working their magic. Sequence 9 of the Fool Pathway, Seer, providing enhanced memory, spiritual intuition, divination abilities, enhanced spirituality, and finally, access of ritualistic magics. Sequence 9 of the Error Pathway, Marauder, providing enhanced dexterity, strength, and agility, night vision, mastery of theft, superior observation on the border of mystical. And finally, Agile Hands, which provides mastery over combat. Sequence 9 of the Door Pathway, Apprentice, providing mastery over spirit vision, ability to open doors inside of walls and other objects, effectively allowing a person to go through them, and finally, ability to lockpick any non-mystical and some mystical doors. All 3 combined, although did not offer an instant power-up, made way for an increasingly annoying combo. It could be said that even at Sequence 9, the Beyond of the Cowardly Trio pathway were particularly harder to kill than any other pathway. Again, he looks around. Nothing but the dirt, the stone, and the darkened walls of a godforsaken land. He did not where he had ended up at, but he knew everything was very much real. As someone that had mastered lucid dreaming, he knew the feeling of a dream. The clear distinction between a dream and reality was the difference between night and day for him. If he couldn't tell, he wouldn't expect anyone to. He did not know how, but the contents of the dream had not only been contents. They had somehow turned real and transported him to this place. It was surreal more than anything. Stranger than the black nights of the darkened hell he lived and thrived in, and more eerie than anything his transcendent imagination could ever hope to come up with. Getting up, he felt his body. It was strong. The strength he felt coursing through him was unlike anything he had ever felt when he was still back home. He balled his fists up and punched the air. A slight whistling sound gave out as the punch fell on empty air. Winston turned back and punched again. Then with his right fist, and again with the left. Each punch left a whistling sound hanging in the air, the slightest of hum buzz that would normally be hard to pick up on. Hoo, he breathed. Then, with a tremendous effort of the legs, he began running. His legs carried him faster than he had ever run before, a speed which he felt was equivalent to about 36 kilometers per hour, or 10 meters per second. Stopping just before a wall, he punched the solid stone. Bam! A crisp sound ran out, with a depression appearing at the spot of impact. He pulled his arm back, his fist bruised from the impact. The wall before him had a large prominent crack running down from the place he had just punched, with various secondary cracks running along like the tributaries of a river or the branches and roots of a tree. Winston nodded to himself. Physicals have been enhanced tremendously. I'm quicker on my feet and strength is above human terms. My observation skills have also been tested. Winston looked back. Ads by Pub Future, the slightest footprints that would normally be invisible, the little rocks he had kicked up while running, the strange layout of the cave, the way the wind moved in the space, everything was visible to him. His entire body became an observational machine, perfectly optimized to notice any changes, ticks, and things he would find advantageous in the environment. Now, the only thing left to find out is the spirit vision and the door openings. I can't check ritualistic magic about now due to lack of materials. Winston mused. Without wasting any time, he sat cross-legged on the ground and began to concentrate. Winston roughly remembered the concepts of cogitation and how it helped concentrate and utilize spirituality. And being an apprentice and seer, he had the instinctive advantage while trying out such things. Turning his mindscape blank, he imagined a perfectly round ball, a black sphere of unimaginable mass, that strangely enough, curved inwards to the top, yet it didn't. A non-Euclidean geometrical shape. The first step of cogitation was to focus the mind and direct the energy seepage to a single nov, L, B // J and N point. As he did so, a plethora of colors unfolded before his eyes. The staggering mosaic of unimaginably high colors that twisted and turned within his mind, like sardines in a school, rendered him unable to think for a moment. Focusing his spirituality, Winston overtook the task of a trigger. He smacked his left thumb and ring finger together over and over again, associating it with the activation and deactivation of spirit vision. Then, finally, he opened his eyes like the enlightened Buddha. The stream of colors were swept in his eyes, drawn towards a gigantic figure that dwarfed any megastructure of the modern age by far. The large behemoth, the tremendously gigantic figure of a billion different colors blended together into the surroundings, making way for a dazzling sight unlike none other. The colors, like a million will-o-wisps rendered free to roam, centered around, cuddled and bellowed to form a large door. Winston's eyes shone with curiosity, however. He soon squashed the curiosity. In such matters, curiosity was fatal. He had not yet judged, known, or theorized about the things that might lie behind the large door. He could not yet hold the luxury of being reckless. Forcibly tearing away his eyes from the door, he looked at his own figure. More specifically, the colors displayed by his astral projection and the ether body. The ether body, the part of the soul most connected with the physical body, exuded a deep white color, almost making his entire body invisible. A sign of great health. As for the astral projection, it exhibited the colors of green and blue, a sign of calm and peace and one of thought respectively. Winston could not help but morph a small smile on his face. This is interesting. For the moment, he decided to familiarize himself with the new skill set he had been provided. Winston dreamt of a god. A god so large that he could not be seen in the clouds from the waist up. The god walked towards a tower and walked atop it. His arms were equally gigantic as his body. He held them out. The tower expanded, and then some more. It kept expanding beyond what the human mind was truly capable of comprehending, eventually overtaking an infinite cosmos. Then, a door appeared to close off the tower, covering everything beyond it like a mist. Winston jolted awake once again. His eyes were unfocused as he thought over the contents of the dream. As a seer, and one with particularly higher spirituality due to the influence of the Marauder and Apprentice potions, dreams were not meant to be ignored. Not all the time, dreams held deeper meaning, as it is the spiritual intuition giving a revelation or warning about whatever it is to come. What is the symbolism behind the dream? I saw the same door in the dream. Winston thought about it for a moment, coming to various conclusions on the get-go. The door leads to a tower. Perhaps the tower might be a symbol for something else, possibly a rise to power considering the figure of a god atop it? A power ladder that allows one to become a god. He mused. I already have a way to ascend to godhood. However, most of the acting required for it needs to interact with other people and get their feedback. Only then can I progress in sequence. Winston shook his head. Whatever it might be beyond the door, it is somewhat clear that it's a path to power, or at least something close to it. Winston completely trusted his spiritual intuition. In the series Lord of Mysteries, Klein's intuition rarely ever failed to deliver, although that too was partly because of the buff of the Sephiroth castle. But as someone that had 3 sequence 9 potions worth of spirituality, he wasn't far behind Klein's intuition. In fact, he might even theorize that he was somewhat more spiritually sensitive. He sighed. His arrival at the space, which was marked 2 days ago, give or take, had been particularly mundane. He had simply appeared. But everything that came with it wasn't. He had been practicing his powers all this time, getting more familiar with it. Along with that, he had practiced cogitation at practically every free instance he got. And since he couldn't stay here indefinitely, which would entail striving to death, and finally having an idea of what was beyond the door, he concluded that there was practically no reason to staying in this place. Winston got up, his eyes turning muddled as he activated his sight, unveiling the secrets beyond vision. The majestic door that spanned hundreds of meters high and hundreds of meters wide appeared in his eyes. Walking forward, he placed his hand onto the ethereal door. Not being physical, it was impossible to touch it normally, save for at the expense of spirituality and using his apprentice powers. The door didn't budge. He concentrated. He used the door opening's abilities of the apprentice pathway to the absolute limit of what his spirituality would allow for. Alas, the conceptual power of a sequence 9's abilities could only get so far. Winston sat back down on the surface of the cave, quietly overlooking the door still. He contemplated. I can't open the doors as of yet. How am I supposed to get in then? He looked around. The cave only extends so far. Even if I use door opening, it only leads to a wall of stone. Meaning, there no other air pockets at least 50 meters from here. Just as he was thinking about his next choice of action, the door suddenly trembled. Ads by Pub Future. The surrounding colors dimmed and scattered as a deep crevice opened within the door. And inside lied an even blinding light than anything the door could ever hope to produce. Winston had the instinct to close his eyes, lest he went blind from the intense light. However, he knew that doing so might make him miss the opportunity, alongside the knowledge that his spirit vision wasn't inherently connected to his physical body, but instead it was information supplied directly to his spiritual body, or the astral projection. The crevice largened, now large enough for an entire person to pass through. No brief moments of hesitation passed him, which might have been indicative of his spirituality warning him. Hurriedly getting off the ground, before the door could close as it was already motioning to, he jumped through the narrow gap into the light, closing off his spirit vision while doing so. Soon, the door closed and the surrounding spiritual colors returned to their usual rest. A lonesome light shone high up above, amidst the spinning mist and the racing winds. The long stone hallways, supposedly untouched for thousands of years, hosting murals of strange imagery and unknown individuals that marred the walls, supposedly unviewed for ages. The entrance to the first floor had finally gotten a visitor. Winston Smith, the enigmatic man, opened his eyes. His upper body was still completely naked with his underside covered only by undies. He propped up his chest and looked around. The murals on the walls, the long, seemingly infinite hallway that extended both ways, and the ceilingless space which had a lone light shining from above gave him the impression that it had not been probed in for centuries. Which would be correct, a sign of his enhanced deduction from the Marauder potion. He got on his feet and looked around. Again. Suddenly, a voice called out, "Oh ho, another irregular? The tower hasn't received such extensive visits from the outside in centuries." A sing-song voice, a deep monotone, said from the side. Winston's sight darted to the speaker, there finding a figure too eerie to describe in any form of beauty or majesty by human standards. It was a humanoid figure, standing at a height of an astonishing range between 180 to 185 centimeters, save for his propped-up ears, which when added made him look about 240 centimeters. He had a pure white skin and an elongated face, which stood almost featuresless if not for a singular slit that traveled lengthwise on the lower part of the head. The back of this slit held clear crystal blue eyes, and the front held an almost unnoticeable row of sharp teeth. His arms were unusually thick for his body structure, at least by human standards, and he wore a purple spandex-like garment. He twirled and twisted a golden staff with crystal balled ends in the air, masterfully displaying tricks with it. Winston readied himself to use spirit vision, wanting to get a clearer picture. However, his thumb accidentally met his middle finger instead of his ring finger. Seeing that, he instantly got rid of any thoughts that still harbored or had yet to arise about using spirit vision on his rabbit-like humanoid being. He distinctively remembered Megos from Lotiem, the one that gave the readers PTSD on pregnant woman that harbored an evil god in her womb. At that moment, a critical detail about spirit vision was understood in the novel. Do not look directly at God. Who are you? Winston asked, throwing to the back of his mind the fact that he had nearly gotten himself killed just a moment ago. The rabbit-like figure didn't notice anything. He again spoke in the same sing-song voice. I am Hedon, the guardian of the first floor of the tower. The tower? Guardian. Tower indeed. What you are inside is the Tower of God. He spread his arms across, as if to take the world into his arms. What do you desire? Money and wealth? Honor and pride? Authority and power? Ads by pub future revenge? Or something that transcends all these? Whatever you desire is here. His staff pointed up. Everything is at the top of the tower. Anything can be achieved at the top. The tower is such a place. Winston looked on. As for me being a guardian, each floor of the tower has a guardian assigned to the specific floor. I am simply the guardian of the first one. Winston nodded. I see. How many floors are there in total, may I ask? Hedon smirked, displaying his front teeth openly. That can only be found as you climb the tower. Do you have what it takes? He asked. Winston quieted down for a moment. It doesn't matter how I got here or how I ended up inside this tower. What matters is I won't survive back in that cave. He looked at the rabbit. As of right now, I need only enter the tower. The rest can be figured out with time. Are there any inhabitants in the tower? Indeed there are. Each floor harbors millions of inhabitants. And they all climb the tower. n/o/val/b/jn.c//om. Not all, no, only the ones I select. And I take it that I've also been selected. Hedon's smirk widened all the way to his eyes. No, you were not chosen by me. You came in on your own. He pointed his stick at Winston. You have chosen yourself. The only question from here is whether you are willing to climb or not. Winston contemplated for a moment. What does that mean? You can find that out on your own. Ads by pub future, he nodded. From his words, I can at least deduce that the people from the outside are few to name. And as of right now, there might have been another visitor before me, or even multiple of them. And supposedly, they might just have some advantages or disadvantages because they have chosen themselves, as opposed to everyone that it chosen. And it suggests a culling mechanism. Not everyone that gets selected can reach the top, meaning there is a competition underway to the top. That means danger. Winston gazed at Hedon, who was smirking at him. How do you climb the tower? You must take a test on each floor to reach the next one. What might be this floor's test? I beginning to like you. The first floor test? Let's see. He scratched his chin. Then behind him, the scenery underwent a change. What was previously a darkened hallway that had no end, a large cage door appeared in its place. A green hue emanated from the air beyond the cage, and water like waves filled the air. The waves rolled and tumbled in the air, like currents in an ocean. And in the waves, a predator lurked. A gigantic fish-like creature with a long tail and two appendages floated silently in the air, swimming in the waves. At the center of the cage, some distance from the door of the cage, some shards of a dark substance were lying there. Slowly, they disappeared and a lonesome door appeared in its place. The first test is simple. Walk through that door, and you pass. And what of that monster? That is a white steel eel, a creature found in the tower. It hasn't eaten anything for some time, so it's particularly aggressive. Winston looked at Hedden in silence, unsure if the rabbit-like figure purposefully wanted to get him killed. I reckon if I don't take the test, I'll be thrown back out. That right? Then that leaves no choice. He steeled his resolve and walked towards the cage. Either he died here from the beast, or went back and died from starvation. It was obvious what he was going to pick. Chapter 4. The second floor before the cage opened for Winston to walk through, whether to his impending death or a great opportunity yet remaining to be seen. He was stopped by Hedden. The rabbit-like guardian propped up his staff before him. I almost forgot to ask, but what is it that you wish to achieve? The same deep monotone voice called out, echoing in the hallway. What do you mean? Everyone has a path to follow in the tower to get to where they wish to. People desire all sorts of things, wishing for all sorts of things, wanting all sorts of things. What are you after? Winston thought for a moment. Purpose, I guess. HOH? A rather philosophical goal you have. Does it matter what goal I have? Does it make a difference in climbing the tower? Winston asked impatiently. Hedden chuckled. I suppose not. Everything can be fulfilled at the top after all. He removed his staff. Then there is one last thing I have to give you, he said. Winston turned to look at him. Hedden, out of nowhere, pulled out a spherical mass, a deep black ball that floated in the air. This is a pocket. Something that is widely utilized in the tower. It will allow you to understand the language of the tower, Maxi Thyan, he said. If he hadn't stopped me just now, wouldn't I have been unable to understand the tower's language? Winston felt distasteful but didn't voice out his thoughts. As the sphere approached him, a steady stream of information invaded his mind. You make the pocket invisible by saying invisible mode, Hedden said. Invisible mode, Winston repeated, and the sphere turned invisible. Interesting, he mused. Then, let us proceed with the test. The door. Hedden smirked and pointed his head ahead towards the cage. Winston didn't speak, only walked towards the cage entrance, which slowly opened like the deep entrancing maws of death. As Hedden turned to be behind him, no longer in the field of vision, Winston tapped his left thumb and ring finger together twice. Immediately, his spirit vision became active and he saw waves. Insurmountable waves, too large to perceive clearly, too many to number, too numerous to count, too beautiful to move his head away. It was a blend of waves that moved about in the air, like a water stream moving down the river. And amidst the waves of water was the behemoth-like being that was the white steel eel. It floated with the help of the waves, following their direction and sometimes manipulating them to his liking. Winston was entranced for a second before he walked into the waves. Immediately, he felt a great pressure on his being. It felt like he was submerged at the bottom of a 7-meter deep pool, something he had previously experienced. Yet, weirdly enough, it was not hard to move as it would normally be under all the resistance. Adds by Pub Future. It felt like he was moving through pure air, yet there was an abnormal pressure that surrounded his body. It did not feel uncomfortable, nor did it feel wrong. It just felt strange. This feels strange, Winston thought as he moved his hand through the waves. Just then, before he even got to fully analyze the situation, a deafening roar sounded. Winston looked over at the large titanous creature that was hurling through the air. The gigantic creature, larger than any other he had ever seen, moved with a frightening speed for its stature. Winston's eyes threaded into needles. Hurriedly, he dashed out of the way and rolled to the right. The white steel eel smashed the ground, creating a deep crevice where Winston's relatively tiny figure had previously stood. The eel stabilized itself back into the air as Winston regained his footing. Winston looked at the target of the test, the door. At the moment, the door was 54 meters away from him, a distance he could reach in 4 seconds. Without wasting any time, he began running towards the thing. The eel, with its large eyes, looked at the running figure of Winston. Why such a large creature would dash for such a tiny one for the sake of eating was beyond him. for there was no way for a creature of such size to get any sort of sustenance by eating him. However, now was not the time to dwell on such things. Winston felt the waves in the air behind him move, and at the same time, looked at the unusual flow before him. He could not look back to see, since Hedden stood at the base of the cage doors, watching him still. At that moment, his sight would turn him into a bulbous mass of flesh that did not perceive anything, and he did not have the luxury of turning it off, since noticing the waves in the air gave information about the eel's irregular movement patterns. Without his spirit vision, prediction could only be left to his spiritual intuition and natural senses. Something that he did not think would keep him alive in such a highly stressful situation where time was the key. Jumping to the right again, he upheld his footing when he saw the waves moving towards him. Immediately dropping down on the floor, he flattened out his body and tried to appear like a sheet of paper. Whoosh! The giant eel passed over him like a truck, almost throwing him off the ground and dragging his body with him like rag doll flowing in the wind. Winston stood up as the eel passed him, and dashed towards the door. The door lied 28 meters away at this point. The eel turned back after passing the gate. It opened its maws to let out a piercing screech and dashed back at him. The enormous wingspan of the beast covered a staggering 50 meters. And this time, with its body close to the ground, it let no room for the previous trick to be played. Winston's muscles tightened. He couldn't avoid the beast. It had come too close. If he jumped towards any side he would be hit by the wings, and then devoured. He kept running at the large sea creature. When the eel came within 5-meter range, he jumped. The maws of the eel opened at the same time. Winston turned his body in mid-air, narrowly avoiding diving headfirst into the mouth of the eel. Adds by pub future his body impacted the hard scales of the eel, scraping off it like a piece of paper rolling across a table. A sense of pain flooded his mind as his background was scraped by the scales. He did not stop, and immediately upon landing, he dashed again towards the door that lied all but 9 meters ahead. Getting to the point in less than a second, almost the time it took for the eel to turn back, Winston immediately activated his ability, door opening. Of course, his intuition and ability to lockpick mundane and mystical doors had already made him well aware that the door would budge with his current strength. It was a trap from the start. Hence, utilizing the door opening ability, the door opened smoothly. A dark black wave of a liquid-like state enveloped him, rushing out of the door at speeds imperceptible to the human eye. And just like that, he disappeared. The white steel eel smashed down on the ground where the door had previously stood, its mind in disarray. Well, I suppose that was a bit too easy. Hedden clicked his tongue, feeling a bit regretful. Truthfully, he had not expected the man to complete the challenge so easily, for if he had, he would have kept a barracuda, the most fiercest beast in the entire tower, instead of a measly white steel eel. Well, what is done is done. His slit opened up, revealing the razor-sharp teeth underneath. N/O/vel/B//JN.C//OM. His crystal blue eyes seemed to peer into the unknown beyond, gazing directly at the figure of Winston who was being transported. Welcome to Tower of God, Mr. Winston. An abstract blend of colors greeted him. Winston's sense of balance was in shambles. There was nothing to stand on in this strange space through which he was evidently being transported to the next floor of the tower. It was a chaotic dance of spiritual energies and colors of 1,000 types, so many in variety that it was impossible to classify them under the traditional blend of color theory. Winston hurriedly turned off his spirit vision, just in time for his feet to find a ground to stand on. He staggered a bit and then regained his footing. He looked around. Everywhere he looked, there was a sea of gold. Large pastures and fields of ripe wheat and aged grass littered the environment, jutting out of the ground as if the earth itself had decided to fill the space with the gold of the ground. Far in the distance, somewhere between 1 to 1.5 kilometers, lied some hills and small rock formations that sloped gently, enough for a normal person to climb up them with ease. And rarely, he saw some figures moving amongst the crowd of wheat and grass. Although the sod broke most of the view, it was quite clear that many people were in the same situation that he was in, observing their surroundings. Adds by pub future. The gentle breeze blew across the fields, swaying the upper tips of the giant gold bounty. Just then, a voice sounded. Mic test? Mic test? 123. Is this working? The voice said, reverberating across the land. Winston looked up at a small box-like object, the thing which had boomed with such a large volume. All right. Attention all regulars. Welcome to the start of your journey, the second floor. The voice continued. Here, you will be judged to be worthy of climbing the tower or not. Let us move on towards your first test. Suddenly, Winston's gaze tightened and he activated his spirit vision. A blend of colors appeared momentarily, and then, the world exploded into waves. There are currently 400 regulars in this area. The test is simple, bring that number down to 200. The voice said. The test starts now. Immediately, Winston felt a change in the waves around him. They seemed to have taken on a darker tone, along with an overall raging feeling, quickly turning into tides. It seems everyone is ready to kill. Here, Winston thought as he looked on at the combat happening in the distance through the wheat fields. And the people in the tower are called regulars, good to know. As he was engrossed in his thoughts, he saw the waves around him shift. Winston stepped back, and just then a man wielding a large broadsword jumped out of the grass in the side, slamming down the sword at the space he has previously occupied. Without missing a beat, Winston drove his fist right into the other party's guts. Bam! Quah! The man's grip on the hilt weakened slightly, and that was enough for Winston to simply slap away his wrists and get the sword for himself. The man staggered back, his eyes widening for a moment. He tried to stabilize himself and go on the offensive, yet Winston was all too quick. Ching! With a quick slice from the sword, the man laid in a pool of his own blood. Chapter 5, Battle Royale. Winston looked at the fallen man's clothes, which had all been soaked in blood. He shook his head, regretful at having wasted a set of clothes. I could have worn them for myself. He looked at his almost naked figure. I need some sort of protection, even the most basic clothes will do. He eyed his surroundings, waiting for the most subtle shift in the waves around him. I guess the fighting I did in my teenage years is starting to pay off. He smiled slightly. Well, it might also be the result of that instinctual fighter thing I got. He looked around with his spirit vision still active. The tumultuous waves were nowhere near the level that the white steel exhibited, making it comparatively harder to pinpoint the change, but it was becoming increasingly obvious the more he looked on. It would seem spirit vision is something broken in this world. Feeling a point object blazing through the waves, producing a noticeable hum, Winston ducked into the grass. Whoosh! An arrow flew right past his head, a second too late at catching him. Winston looked towards the distant hill, where he could see the rough silhouette of a humanoid figure. The figure held a bow in hand. Without a second thought, Winston began to dash through the grassland, rushing straight at the distant rock hill atop which the Lone Ranger stood, all too blissfully ignorant at what was quickly approaching. Seeing a crevice rushing and elongating in the sod, the archer quickly fired in a state of panic. The arrow flew again, finding no target to land on this time too. Seeing the waves in the air seemed to become almost second nature to Winston. His eyes scanned the archer, overlooking his clothes and other equipment. Worth robbing, he thought offhandedly. As the thought arrived in his mind, the simultaneous realization that he was beginning to think like a marauder now dawned on him. He chuckled a bit, quickly reaching the base of the hill. More arrows were fired from the bow, and so they were dodged. Winston moved with a frightening manner, with an unpredictability in his next moves like an insect. The archer, seeing the man reaching the base of the hill he had kept for himself, began running down from the slope. Just then, something grabbed him from the back of the neck. Bam! And then, a rough fist drove itself into his stomach. His eyes almost bulged out of his sockets and spit flew out from the now open jaw. Arg! Ads by Pub Future. He gave out a rough cry of pain. His stomach burned with unending amounts of hair. His grip on the bow loosened and it fell down on the ground. Winston stood behind the man, his broadsword on the ground and his fists ready to pummel him to a near-death state if necessary. He held up the man from his collar and gave him another punch right to the face. The man passed out and Winston took his clothes for himself. Having stripped the man almost naked, Winston cleanly sliced open his throat and ended his life. A bit too tight for my liking, he thought as he stretched the sleeves and the collar of his now ranger-like garment. In more ways than one, it made his range of motion somewhat limited due to the tightness. Then again, the outfit belonged to someone of a shorter and skinnier stature. Without wasting any time, he flung the bow and the quiver to his back and picked up the broadsword. Then, he swiftly climbed up the slope of the hill, like the gentle and concise movements of a mountain leopard. Reaching the top, he looked out. The waves in the air were calming down, no longer as tumultuous as they had been just a couple of minutes ago. The air blew across the land, carrying with it a rough smell of iron. Everyone is ready to kill here. Winston's eyes were serious as he called forth his pocket. Because of Haddon's mention, the fact that the pocket provided necessary information and was widely used in the tower was deeply remembered by him. As such, it was only rational to think that such a used tool would show some important information in the middle of the test. Because as he understood it, the tower inhabitants did not need any pocket to translate the language into Maxi-Thyan, because well, it was their own language. If not for the usage of a translator that it served for him, the obvious function would be n/o/vel/b//in.c//om. The spherical ball appeared beside him, the number on it ticking down rapidly. 347, 331, 328. The number kept ticking down, the pocket floating still in the air. In front of a test that would determine one's worth to ascend to godhood, any casualties were merely reduced to a number, a name on a list, a loser, and a failure. Winston didn't speak anything and closed off the pocket. Now, the real question is, what potion should I go acting towards? He thought. As he understood it, digesting any one of the potions would result in the simultaneous digestion of the other two, which would in turn make him able to ascend to a higher sequence in all three pathways. Or at least that was how the words in the dream made it seem like. Just as he was thinking, the waves around him turned somewhat chaotic. He heard someone walking up behind him. Winston turned to look. Right in front of him stood a tall man, almost 7 feet in height. The man had dark brown hair, propped back using a headband. His eyes were of a deep shade of crimson, and the strangest thing about him was undoubtedly his skin color. It was a bright shade of red, as if the blood was shining clean through his skin. Another strange deformity about the man was the fact that he had 2 sets of arms. On his chest, he wore a simple cloth in a cross formation, barely providing any form of protection or fulfilling the goal of covering his body. Below, he wore a small loincloth. In his upper pairs of arms, he held 2 scimitars. Well well, what do we have here? The man, nay, the thing wasn't a man. It was of some other species that inhabited the tower, some species capable of slanderous acts of violence and depravity, as such was the visual impression that his figure brought him. His face was a maniacal grin, just that, along with a mashed-up sneer somewhere in there among the slightest muscular movements of his face. At least that was what it looked to be in Winston's eyes. And, considering his marauder observational skills, he was confident about being right. Such an obnoxious brute, the bright red horrible that stood before him held on his body the clothing stained by the blood of the people that previously crossed his path. Bad luck to you, pal, the creature said, his scimitars readying for action. In response, Winston snorted coldly. It seems that you've received some brain damage. You should die already. Every moment you spend breathing is an insult to the intellectually gifted, he said, a scowl marring his ads by pub future face. As soon as his words landed, the red man, at first adopted a confused expression. Then, an angry expression appeared on his face. You! He yelled, and then without stop, he rushed at Winston, his scimitars held high and ready to strike. Winston readied his broadsword in response, adopting a stance. The red brute swung his swords at him. He stepped back, almost towards the precipice of the hill. His figure staggered back a bit before stabilizing itself. The red brute smirked, his confidence gaining a sudden boost. Using his longer arms as leverage, the again swung his scimitar in a horizontal sweep. As the swing approached, Winston smirked. With a tremendous effort on his legs, he jumped from the precipice, right over the sword swing and stabbed with his broadsword. Skhhh. Arg! The broadsword embedded itself into the left shoulder of the man, narrowly missing his eye, which was the intended target. The brute had realized at the last moment the consequence that would be of his momentary loss of reason and his blind charge into an enemy, and so, had adjusted accordingly to get the least possible damage. Tap! Winston, with his broadsword somewhat lathered in blood, landed behind him, and no sooner did his feet touch the ground than he started to run down the slope. The brute turned back, his lower right arm holding the disgusting wound as his shoulder. His shoulder blade had been completely pierced through, leaving a crevice-like hole throughout. The muscles were damaged and the arm seemed to have been rendered limp as the upper arm dangled down. The scimitar that was previously held in the same arm had already been moved to his lower left arm. Get back here, you bastard! He yelled, again charging in a rage. Brutes, they never learn, Winston thought in disdain. Just as the slope broke off beneath his feet, Winston turned and gripping the broadsword like he would a spear, he threw it with as much strength as he could muster. Adds by pub future his feet slid back a bit due to the momentum he carried and the sword whizzed forward with a noticeable howl of the wind. As a sequence. 9 Marauder, although his strength had not been enhanced to a terrible degree as one would see in cases like a Beyonder of the Red Priest pathway, coupled with his already well-built physique and exercised muscles, it proved to be barely enough to throw such a heavy object as a projectile. The brute's eyes widened in shock and he tried to lean back. The sword passed by him in the air, slashing a small part of his neck as it did so. Stabilizing himself, the brute looked at Winston, only to find the comparatively smaller man pointing a bow at him. The bow was loaded with an arrow pointing straight at the four-armed red brute. And then, Winston said something. Tough luck, he said, and the arrow fired. Whoosh! As quick as his reflexes might be, the man couldn't dodge the arrow aimed at his throat in time. Spurt! Gewer! The man fell down on the hot stone, his throat pierced by an arrow. Blood poured incessantly from his wound, and as the blood filled his windpipe and eventually his lungs, he saw the cold look of the man he had deemed as an easy prey. His eyes began to glaze over as tears began to appear inside them. They flowed in a steady stream, as if the brute, no, the man was pouring out all of his past traumas and fears out into the open before the one that had relieved him of his biggest treasure. And then, darkness consumed him. Winston looked annoyed. He covered his nose to block out of the scent of the man's urine. And then, after climbing up the hill once again to pick up the broadsword, he was on his way, this time through the fields. Staying on an elevated height might prove to be beneficial to a ranged fighter. It was even preferable for the melee fighters in such situations like this. However, Winston felt that there were stronger opponents still in the area. Just because he had met people that could not fight properly and were beaten easily, did not mean he could openly display himself like so. Hiding under the hill was also not a great option. Such high grounds were ideal for predators to spot prey in the distance. As such, he did not doubt that many people would be heading to the stone hill, just as the red man had done. A/N, can spirit vision be used indefinitely if there's no corruption knowledge to be seen anywhere? I don't think we've ever seen prolonged usage of spirit vision, but mystery prior pathways higher sequences have. The problem that their spirit vision is so powerful that they unconsciously glance at things they shouldn't. So, seeing that, I think with the combined spirituality of Marauder and Apprentice, along with the natural talent of spirit vision of Seer and Apprentice, I would assume that Winston should be able to keep up spirit vision indefinitely, unless of course, he gets into contact with someone of a higher natural order of life. Chapter 6, Teammates. As Winston moved through the grass, he spotted a group of individuals traveling. Evidently, they had banded together to survive in the test. When they saw Winston, their very first instinct was to attack. Without having to state it out, they were all killed without a second thought. Winston's ability to read the strange waves in the air, coupled with his natural instincts as a fighter, proved to be more than a match for some half-baked warriors. If they hadn't provoked him, Winston might have let them go, but alas, they had done so. This is a lot more comfortable, thought Winston, admiring his new clothing. One of the people he had taken care of among the group had a similar body shape to him. Along with that, his clothes were rather comfortable and modernized. A simple t-shirt and pants. However, Winston still chose to wear the Ranger's open armor bands above the clothing, not only to hold the quiver, but also for protection. One might never know where even the smallest of protection can play a role. Nov. L.B//JNN. Just then, his spirit vision detected a shift in the waves. Immediately, he grabbed his broadsword and got into a stance. 2 people, one from the right and one straight ahead. He surmised. The rustling of the wheat and sod came from the right. Winston turned, his keeping the other side in his vision. Rustle, 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 rustle. As the grass rustled, something came out. It was a large behemoth, a figure that could barely be described as a human. The figure had 2 arms and 2 legs, a mouth and a head. However, on its pale oval head, which was as yellow as its body, not an ounce of hair was visible. Instead, numerous eyes littered the top of its head in a horizontal line, all around in a circle. The underside of this strange creature was covered by a brown loin cloth, save for which it was completely naked. Each of the creature's arms was as thick as Winston's waist, appearing extremely powerful. However, the overall demeanor of the humanoid cyclopean-looking figure was lethargic and non-violent. As soon as it stepped out into the view and Winston became visible, it stopped. Then it quietly stared at Winston. Some time elapsed. Sweat began to accumulate on Winston's temples because of the heat in the environment, coupled with the tenseness of the situation. Then, the second figure, that was still yet hidden, came into view. With the rustling of grass, a cocky voice sounded. "I would put down the sword if I were you." The voice spoke. It was the voice of a male, one that seemed particularly pretentious and arrogant. Having spoken, a young man in his 20s walked out of the cover of wheat. He stood at a height of about 5 foot 11 inches, a but smaller than Winston, who was 6 foot 1 inches. His hair was wild, sprawled all over and jutting out into the air, overall looking quite absurd. It seemed to be one of the instances where anime hair seemed to fit in the anime, yet failed to be appealing in the real world. His hair was of a dirty brown color with shades of black in them. His eyes were brown, mimicking the color of his hair. His overall demeanor was of a hardened warrior, which was well told in the matters of his body. His lean but packed muscles suggested untold hidden strength. His upper body was covered by a tight shirt of primarily white color, yet riddled with red streaks diagonally across. Along with that, he wore protection straps which were also red in color. HPZ book power 39.6 centimeters, 15.6, G10A mobile workstation PC, silver AMD Ryzen 9 processor. Windows 11 Pro, 39.6 centimeters, 15.6, diagonal FHD display with NVIDIA RTX 2008 generation. 16 GB DDR5 RAM. 1 TB SS. HP. And check out our recommendations curated just for you. Check out our recommendations curated just for you. Discovery feed ads by Pub Future. On his legs, he wore loosely fitting pantaloons, which looked more like pajamas. He has a spear swung over his left shoulder and appeared arrogant. His chin was held high, eyeing him with interest. "What do you mean?" Winston asked cautiously. "Their kind is mostly peaceful. They don't attack unless provoked first." The man glanced at the creature. "However, they do hold great capacities for violence." Having said that, the small clearing that they stood in again descended into stillness. After a bit of thought, Winston calmly put down his sword and relaxed his figure, never taking a moment to look anywhere else than the two figures. The large creature staggered for a moment, before again continuing to walk. The creature descended into the grass and walked away. Eventually, even the rustling caused by him stopped. "See? I told ya, didn't I?" the man said. Winston pointed his sword at him. "And what do I make of you?" he asked. Hey, no need for that." He held up his right hand, his spear still flung over his left shoulder. "I wouldn't want to kill someone if it was avoidable." "I hold the same sentiments," Winston said. "But there's nothing stopping anyone here, is there?" he continued. The wild man laughed with a maniacal grin. "Damn right there ain't," he continued, "but I'm not looking to make any enemies here. Especially people like you." Winston raised an eyebrow. "I can practically feel that you're strong." The man pointed at his head. "Anyone that can't tell that isn't actually a warrior. Your stance doesn't suggest that you're a beginner. You might not be too accomplished in the art, but you're definitely skilled enough to defend yourself. And you want to team up then?" Winston asked, reading the man's intentions. "Bingo." The man snapped his fingers. Then, before Winston was able to say anything, something spoke all across the fields. "Attention all regulars," the voice said. "Stop fighting. The test is now over. Anyone still fighting after the announcement will be eliminated." Just as the voice sounded, Winston saw the subtle shift in the waves all around, which calmed down completely, now appearing like the gentle tides that impact the beach. "Great. Now, on to the next test. To climb the tower, personal strength alone is not enough. So, you must make teammates. Make 3 teammates in the duration of 5 minutes. Anyone that doesn't have 3 teammates by the end will be eliminated. To signify that you have a teammate, you must be touching the people by the end of the 5 minutes." Winston turned to look at the man, his expression turning thoughtful. "They must be trying to test our adaptability and flexibility. Making friends with people you just tried to kill, and with the short time frame, finding someone else in the field would surely be a challenge. As such, people have no choice but to befriend their immediate enemies. Quite a sadistic method, but extremely practical. This way, even the people that have hid during the entire battle royale will be forced to come out and partake in the test. Winston shook his head and looked at the man again. So, wanna team up? Winston nodded. I don't see any reason not to. With that they shook hands. Their bodies were still positioned in a manner through which they could defend if the other party tried something, even though the voice had made it plenty clear that those that do not follow the rules would be eliminated. It was simply a form of caution. One must never be too trusting in such a situation. Winston Heath, he said. Zarhan. The man replied, the same smile plastered on his face. Winston motioned with his head. Let's go and find our third member now. The man nodded and they departed from the clearing, in search of their third teammate. The young man runs until his legs can't anymore. His pursuers are all too far behind, or perhaps they're approaching rapidly. He couldn't know in any way. He huffed and laid on the ground. His life was no longer just his own. Remembered his partners laying in a pool of blood as the authorities killed them all so mercilessly. Why is this happening? All we did was steal some food? He weeps under the wooden table, over which the sky itself cries down a torrent of raindrops. Snot runs down his face, he covers his eyes, shielding himself from all the dangers and fears of the world. And then, a god appeared before him. Bathed in a golden light, rising from nothingness like a transcendent figure of his wildest imaginations. The white god appeared all-encompassing. The small rocks on the ground stretched out their shadows into thin lines that spanned innumerable distances in front of his radiance, and one of his own appeared behind him, stretching on for miles. The white razor teeth of the radiant god were hidden under the black slit that extended to the back of his head. His glory couldn't be described in mere words. Oh, how glorious he was! I will give you a chance to be something bigger. Tell me, what it is that you wish for. The voice of the god boomed in the surroundings. The young man's eyes were clouded with tears, yet no more flowed. The sky, as if mimicking his own state, had stopped. The incessant rain that just before poured down like a broken tap. I want to be free. The young man yells. Adds by pub future. The god smirks. Then, you will have the chance to climb the tower. And with that, the young man appears in a sea of gold, grass, and wheat all around. Then, a strange box that floated in the air spoke the words. And then, the killing began all over. The young man cowered in fear, and then ran for his life. He knew where he was. The floor of tests, the place where the journey of a ranker began, the journey to a better tomorrow. But, I can't do this. His hand trembled as he held a knife stained in red. Another young soul, younger than him, laid motionless on the dirty ground, his throat cut open by the weapon he currently held, and at some point was held by the same one who had been delivered to death's door. Huff, huff, huff. The young man hyperventilated. He ran and ran, away from the ones that chased him and away from those that wanted to kill him. Eventually, he hid behind a rock formations, shielded by a large stone hill. There he sat, silently weeping, muffling over his own voice, as the box once again delivered the words. It was something about finding teammates. The young man lay there silently for about a minute. Time passed in the same stillness, the one sound being the rustling of the grass in the breeze. Sniff. I need to go. He spoke, and got up. The young man walked in a random direction, letting the wind take him to his destination. He sniffed and whimpered. Eventually, he heard someone walking through the sod. Rustle, rustle. Rustle, rustle. Two men walked out, one with dark black hair, wearing a white t-shirt, and the other with dirty brown hair wearing tightly fitting white shirt having red streaks diagonally across. Hey, look. A potential teammate. The one with brown hair exclaimed. Chapter 7. Regulars. Winston and his new teammate Zarhan walked for some time, not finding any person to get into their team. Within this short time frame, Winston had deeply analyzed Zarhan's astral projection and ether body. His entire astral projection was bathed in a red glow, a color that meant passion and extroversion, along with a secondary color which was yellow, symbolizing happiness and extroversion. However, within, it held a tinge of blue, which meant coldness and stillness and that one who is in thought. Seeing this, Winston felt both relieved and wary. Relieved because his new teammate wasn't simply a mindless brute, someone that doesn't think before acting, and wary because of the same. On the outside, the man appeared quite rambunctious, and truthfully, he was. But within, Somewhere he held a calculating personality as well, however small it may be. Winston nodded imperceptibly to himself. Man, we're not gonna find any teammates like this, Zarhan yelled while summoning forth his pocket. The pocket held a timer that ticked down, no counting 3:43, 42, 41. Seeing this, Winston's eyes narrowed. Not getting a teammate means failing the test. Though I won't be thrown back into the outside, there's always the possibility that I wouldn't be able to re-enter the tests. Although he wasn't too knowledgeable about the modus operandi of the tests, Winston felt like not taking any chances. Immediately, he deeply scanned the airwaves. Then, finding nothing worthwhile, he stabbed his sword weakly into the ground. Wait, he said softly. Huh. Zarhan looked confused. His eyebrow was raised as he looked at the silent figure of Winston. Closing his eyes, Winston repeated a phrase 7 times. The person closest to us. The person closest to us. The person closest to us. Although he was somewhat doubtful about divination, since he somewhat remembered about using specific languages to utilize divination, which he didn't know, he couldn't help but try in the common language of the tower, Maxithian. Even if he remembered incorrectly, and divination could be used without any specific language, it was better to try. Imagine him failing to get a teammate because he kept thinking that dowsing rod seeking needed Hermes language, when in fact it didn't. He wouldn't be able to show his respect to the fool. Praise the fool? He yelled in his mind at the end and let go of the hilt of the sword. The sword stood still for a moment before pointing slightly to the right. The surreal sight of the sword hung midair without falling over was strange to say the least, but then again, it was possibly the least strangest thing he had experienced in these days. Ads by Pub Future. Winston grabbed the hilt of the broadsword and motioned for his teammate to follow him. This way, he said simply. Whoa, what did you do just now? Is that some special Shinsu art? Are you a Shinsu user? Zarhan yelled, hurriedly following along. Shinsu? Winston expressed his doubt in his mind, but didn't dare voice them out. Having the marauder's sense of observation was transcendentally helpful. From the short sentences, he had deduced the fact that Shinsu might just be something that was commonplace in the tower and was mundane knowledge. And the way Zarhan had spoken about the so-called Shinsu users, Winston felt that they might just be something special. Who knows? Winston smiled and shrugged his shoulders. Maybe you'll find out in the future, he continued. Zarhan looked at him weirdly. Can't you just answer the question? He thought in confusion. Indeed, Winston was well suited to be a beyonder of the coward trio pathways.n/o/vel/b/jn.c//om. Speaking of, the fact that divination was not in need of the special languages was a deep relief for Winston. Obviously, it could also be possible that Maxithian itself was capable of doing the same at a smaller scale, but Winston doubted the fact, considering how commonplace the language supposedly was in the tower. Actually, won't I receive some mystical knowledge at some point in the Marauder pathway? Or was it the apprentice pathway? Winston mused while walking through the grass. Just then, they walked into a smaller clearing, about 2 meters in diameter. At the same time, Zarhan yelled with fervor. Hey, look! A potential teammate. Winston looked at the figure of the young man that had appeared before them. The young man stood at a height of 6 foot 1 inch, just as big as Winston himself. He had dark black hair and eyes of similar color. He wore a beige robe, loosely fitting on his thin and lanky figure, making him look somewhat comical, if not for the large stain of crimson blood that marred the entire front section of the robe. His eyes were a little maddening, constantly shaking, and were a little red. Streaks across his cheeks suggested that he had been crying. Bro, are you alright? Zarhan asked, gazing at the newcomer strangely. Why you guys, will you please be my teammates? The man yelled, stuttering in between the words. Winston narrowed his eyes but didn't say anything. Zarhan looked back at him. Visible mode, Winston said, and a spherical ball appeared beside him. His pocket. The pocket still counted down on the timer. 24:57, 56, 55, the time's running out. We won't be able to find anyone else. We'll just have to make do with what he got, Winston said, almost whispering. Zarhan nodded. Then, a silly smile appeared on his face. Well, you're in luck today, little man. We just happen to lack a party member, Zarhan said. Ads by Pub Future. He walked towards the young man and patted his back wildly, making him stagger. Ah, thank you very much, the young man yelled, flustered. What's your name? Mine's Zarhan. My name is Aman, the man yelled. Suddenly, hearing his name, Winston's footing staggered and he almost stumbled down into the ground. What could he do? The name was all too familiar. What's wrong? Zarhan asked him, seeing him so stoked by the mention of the young man's name. Nothing. He shook his head. Just a familiar name, that's all. Zarhan somewhat narrowed his eyes, almost imperceptible. However, the change was caught in Winston's eyes. My name is Winston Heath. You can just call me Winston, he said. Of course, Mr. Winston, the man yelled. Winston didn't bother correcting him. He could call him whatever he so desired. It was not his job to bother with the young man. If he wanted to add the little bit of respect to his name, he would let him do so. Phew, man, I was almost worried that we wouldn't find anyone. Glad we did, Zarhan said, sitting down onto the ground. I wouldn't be so happy just yet, Winston thought, looking at the nervous figure of Aman. We don't know his capabilities. Going forward, we would surely need to take tests as a team. When that happens, if he's a good for nothing, we'll be under great disadvantage. He shook his head. There was no use thinking about it at this time. With only 10 seconds left, the only thing they could do was form the team. Thinking of anything beyond that was simply a waste of time. Before long, the time came and the voice began to count down from 5. Winston, Zarhan, and Aman touched each other's shoulders, and eventually, as the countdown hit 0, a distant cry was heard. Winston couldn't quite hear it correctly. Perhaps it was something about turtles? Anyway, with a flash of light, they were transported from their place to another. Winston closed his eyes for a moment, the sudden flash of light coming as a surprise. Before he opened them, he tapped his thumb and ring finger twice, turning off the spirit vision. It was always good to be cautious in such matters. He wouldn't want to accidentally see something that he shouldn't have and turn into a puddle of blood on the ground. It was always a quick and efficient way to kill oneself in the Lotium verse. He opened his eyes and looked around. Where they had appeared seemed to be some sort of a hall, easily capable of hosting more ads by Pub Future than 500 people, with more than enough room to spare still. The entire hall was sparsely filled with dozens upon dozens of other regulars, the other contestants of the test. At the far end of the hall, there was a slight splatter of stairs which led to a tunnel-like walkway, beyond which what lied couldn't be inferred. Winston, seeing that there was no perceptible danger in activating spirit vision, tapped his fingers and the waves once again filled his eyes. Silently, he gauged the other contestants. The majority of the regulars were somewhat battered and bruised, some even badly damaged, a result of the fighting that had ensued downwards. Whoa, this is what I'm talking about, Zarhan yelled with a smile. The spear hung atop his right shoulder. Aman at the side also looked around in amazement and shock. There's a lot of people here, Aman said meekly. Those are all our enemies? Watch out, Aman. Keep keen observation, Zarhan told. Aman nodded seriously. Winston ignored them and continued to gauge the other regulars. Just then, his sight landed on something. A gigantic collection of brilliance, an epicenter of a tumultuous hurricane. The eye of the storm that flung the waves around itself like it were an adult pulling along splinters of paper. The large collection of waves seemingly took the shape of a sword-like bladed weapon, tampering at the top, jet black in color, which he could see with his spirit vision, even thought the sword was covered by cloth. The entirety of the glorious wave dance that seemed to be happening around the sword almost occupied half of the hall, appearing blinding even. It was to the point that Winston seriously considered himself having some brain damage, considering that he had not noticed such a terrible disturbance first. In fact, the entire thing was terribly hidden, right until he had cast its gaze at the one that held it. It was a weak-looking boy with innocent eyes. He had brown chestnut hair and the same brown eyes. His overall figure was seemingly petite and looked extremely weak. Winston's eyes widened in confusion and in shock. Then, the sword trembled. And with it, the waves too. Winston hurriedly teared off his eyes from the sword as he felt a slight irritation in his temples. He looked the other way, wanting to ignore the sword and its holder entirely. I'll scan the other side and turn off the spirit vision, he thought. As his eyes scanned the other side, his gaze fixated on another peculiar person. It was a lady, quite short in stature, green in color and yellowish-brown eyes. She had short brown hair and held a peculiar weapon in hand. It was a large hook-like structure, more like a fishing rod than a weapon used to practical combat. The weapon was slung over her shoulders. However, the peculiar thing was the same. A turbulent raging current of waves all around itself, forming a circle with it as the epicenter. The weapon trembled again, and with it, the waves too. Tapping his fingers hurriedly, Winston turned off his spirit vision. What the fuck? Chapter 8, Barrier. Winston felt his head spinning. Seeing two weapons of such a caliber that they could elicit such a profound power in the surroundings waves in the same hallway was particularly baffling. Is such a level of strength common place? He thought grimly. And so, the urge to rapidly act and progress in sequence arose in his mind. Just as he was thinking, a small commotion at the other side of the hallway overtook his attention. It seemed to be a fight between two of the contestants, one of which had had his arm badly wounded by the other party, and now was asking for compensation. Winston and his teammates looked on in silence. To the side, he heard Zarhan speak. What idiots! He shook his head. As Winston was about to say something, a resounding voice boomed in the hall. I believe everyone was prompted to cease all sorts of fighting. It seems people don't take the words of a test administrator seriously, said the voice, the source of which was a tall man standing right before the hallway that led to some unknown place. The man stood at a height of 2 meters, with his hair a light color of blonde with bright golden eyes. His eyes held 2 black spots under them and his body was somewhat muscular, even clearly showing under his clothes. He wore a white lab coat with black trousers and gloves of the same color. My name is Luro Aro, your test administrator. Nice to meet you, the tall man said. Winston cringed inwardly at the display. At the far side, the two people who were fighting stopped, their attention riveted to the enigmatic man who had just arrived. Test administrator? That means he's a ranker. One of them asked dumbfoundedly. Ranker? Winston thought. That's right. Luro Aro smiled. The regular who had been making trouble backed off, making remarks like only letting you go because the ranker is here. With that sorted, the ranker spoke again. Then, attention all regulars. First of all, congratulations to everyone that has passed the test. He continued. Before we move on to the next, there will be a short pre-test that would be conducted by me. As his words landed, a wave of displeasure coursed through the crowd. All the regulars present publicly expressed their dissatisfaction, lampooning incessantly about not getting any rest and the rankers not having any patience. Seeing this, Luro Aro put his hands up. Now, don't worry, the pre-test is very simply. In fact, I wouldn't even classify it as a pre-test. It's more like a chore than anything. Another thing to mention is that fact that anyone that cannot make it through this test would not be eligible to partake in the next one. In essence, this is another elimination test. The gossip among the regulars started again, this time, even louder. Then, the ranker didn't care. He ignored them and stretched his hand out. Let us begin. With a shout, a transparent blue ball of water appeared in his hands. Without anyone having the appropriate time to react, the ball exploded into a mountain's worth of water, pushing away everyone in a glorious tsunami-like wave. Winston's eyes widened as he saw the display. Their team stood mostly at the deep edge of the hall, meaning that the waves failed to reach them. The water splashed around in the air for a moment, pushing out the regulars to the back of the hall, crowding the otherwise open space. Winston felt the entire display eerily familiar. That's right. It was the same waves that he had looked at whenever he activated spirit vision. Is this Shinsu? Shinsu. Help. Ads by Pub Future YAAA. A wave of surprise swept over the crowd of regulars. Winston didn't miss the short exchange of the word Shinsu. That right. It's Shinsu. The test administrator spoke, prompting Winston to listen in carefully. I compressed the Shinsu to make a barrier and pushed you all out. Shinsu exists everywhere in the tower. It is what allows us to breathe and drink water. Without Shinsu, nothing would exist. Shinsu can allow one to have limitless power and glory, propelling people to the height of rankers. He continued speaking, as if a man of God was preaching a sermon to the uneducated and unenlightened masses. However, some people even use Shinsu as a murder weapon. It can be used to break an arm and do all sorts of miracles. But there are some that aren't able to deal with it well. Such people are not appropriate to be contestants in the tower. Luro pointed to the veil of water in front. Anyone that can pass through this veil won't have any adverse reactions to Shinsu as well. In other words, they pass the test. If all the team members pass through, the team is considered to have passed. And those who don't fail. He smiled. Then good luck, regulars. Wait. Someone within the regulars yelled. What if a single person within the team can't pass through? Isn't it obvious? The entire team fails. Luro said tersely. Winston's eyes widened. He sneaked a glance at Amon near him. Damn. What I suspected has come to fruition. We may not be able to pass through this. The regulars screamed at the ranker, talking about how unfair such a setting was. The ranker ignored them for a moment before he spoke up again. What do you think is the most crucial thing to climb the tower? He said. Feeling the silence permeate the entire hall, he smiled. It's luck. The luck of having a strong body, the luck of being smart, the luck of being rich, the luck of saving a teammate, the luck of escaping from death. The only reason you're here right now is because you're lucky. He spread out his arms. And here you say it's unfair to base the test on luck? Stop your mindless blabbering and take the test, you regulars. He said, quieting down finally. God damn it. Zarhan angrily slammed his foot on the floor, his eyes glancing at Amon in a not-so-subtle fashion. Amon, who was more unconcerned about the test, looked down at his feet. Now what? What are we gonna do? He asked him. As Winston was about to speak, a meek voice came from the other side of the veil. Excuse me, Mr. Luro. The voice spoke. The eyes of almost every regulars in the hall turned to the small boy that currently stood alone at the other side of the veil. I wasn't pushed back. Do I go back and re-enter? The boy asked the test administrator. Luro glared at the boy, who shivered. I am sorry, I'll go back and re-enter, he said. That won't be necessary. Before he could move, he was stopped by Luro. Perhaps it was a mistake on my part, but this is also your luck. You pass, he said. Hearing his words, many regulars expressed their dissatisfaction, but it all fell on deaf ears. Winston glared at the boy, more specifically, his weapon. That boy is in no way ordinary. Such a weapon with such overwhelming power. What was it called? Shinsu? Winston shook his head and looked forward. He glanced at Amon again and began to rock his head, trying to think of a way to pass. Winston did not doubt himself to pass through. Ads by Pub Future. The moment the ranker had pushed the water out, he had activated 5 or more seconds to analyze the veil. The waves weren't as tumultuous as they were on the first floor where he had taken Hedon's test. He could keep his spirit vision going indefinitely, but the presence of the weapons, with their gigantic wave hurricane, messed with his vision, making it practically harder to see anything useful. It was not a matter of not being able to, just a matter of displeasure at the presence of Nov, L, B / JN and the 2 weapons. Amon said at the side. Don't worry, Mr. Winston, Mr. Zarhan, I swear I will pass this test, he said, his eyes filled with determination. Winston looked at him, finding his little bout of motivation heartwarming. Unfortunately, motivation isn't going to get us anywhere, he thought. Then, he began to walk towards the veil. Oh, going already? Zarhan asked behind him. You guys come behind me, he said simply. As of right now, he could not see any way that could enable him to help Amon, even if he wanted to do so. All he could do was hope that he had what it takes. Winston passed through the veil without problems, barely feeling a breeze. To him, it did not feel at all like he had walked through a filter meant to provide restriction to the regulars. Walking cleanly through the veil, just after the green-skinned girl, Winston looked back at the veil. Zarhan held his spear and also walked to the barrier. Then, stepping forward, he also moved through the 5-foot-width barrier, without issue. After walking through, he too looked back to the figure of their last teammate, who had yet to pass through the barrier. Amon steeled himself and walked forward as well. First, he poked the barrier with his finger. It offered no real resistance. However, when he tried to push his entire hand through it, it became solid and inertial, something like a non-Newtonian fluid, getting more solid when more force is applied. Crack! The Shinsu barrier cracked with energy as Amon's hand was pushed back. Amon winced a bit. He looked at Winston and Zarhan, who were both standing on the other side of the barrier. Winston gestured for him to come over as well, as did Zarhan in a more vocal way. Come on. What are ya waiting for? he said, holding his spear above himself. Amon tried again. Yet he could not break through the barrier. After about 5 tries from Amon, about 20% of the regulars had already crossed over, with more and more trying their own attempt. Adds by Pub Future. Between this, a regular was creating quite a ruckus on the other side, which made the ranker, Luro teach then a lesson. Eventually, Winston, who had been giving Amon motivation from the other side of the barrier side, and sat down onto the stairs. With a serious glare, he looked at Amon, who was desperately trying to cross the barrier. Is it really no good? Winston looked at his feet in contemplation. Zarhan took a seat beside him. What do we do now? Wait for our deaths, I suppose, Winston said, a chuckle escaping his lips as he remembered the first few volumes of the second book of Lord of Mysteries. What? Are you retarded? Why would we die? You didn't damage your brain while fighting down there, did you? Zarhan yelled into his ear. Just for that, Winston could not help but contemplate how his enigmatic teammate would fare as a beyonder of the Red Priest pathway. Zarhan clicked his tongue. TCH? Just great. I have a retard and a useless man-child on my team. Winston's head popped a vein. Would you shut up? I'm trying to think, you useless brute, Winston said calmly. Huh? You shut the hell up, Zarhan yelled in frustration. Calm down, Winston yelled in his heart, calming himself down. He held his head, trying to muffle out the shouts that Zarhan was directing right at him. Why did I choose this guy as a teammate? He lampooned inwardly. At the other side of the barrier, Amon, watching his teammates eventually sit down in frustration, clenched his fists and gnashed his teeth together. Am I really so useless? He thought to himself. Just then, a flood of visions appeared in his mind. Vistas of his time in the outer tower, scrounging for food and spending his days stealing and living off of thievery. And eventually, the visions of blood came to cover them all. No, he yelled in his mind. That will not happen again. With that thought, he plastered his body right onto the Shinsa barrier. The barrier offered resistance, pushing him back. Come on. Push through. Beyond the barrier, Winston glanced at the barrier, only so see Amon face planted on the other side. And just a tiny bit, his face was somewhat pushing through. Winston's fate lit up in hope. Amon pushed with his entire being, using his legs and hips to the limit. And so, pass he shall. Bam! Amon fell onto the ground on the other side, bruising his nose in the process. Winston and Zarhan got up, both rushing to the man. Good job, kid, Zarhan yelled. Way to go. Winston also expressed his excitement. Amon smiled at his two teammates. I made it, he cheered. Chapter 9, More doors. After the little pre-test was over, all the regulars that has passed were taken to a waiting area. The regulars that failed, however, were ruthlessly rejected and failed the floor of tests before the tests even began. All regulars line up. The next test will be conducted on a first-come first-serve basis. A woman yelled, dressed in a yellow costume with black stripes on it. I'm the test guide, Yellowy, she said cheerfully. For more instructions, please listen to the test guide robot. She pointed to the floating robot beside her. Yellowy? Seriously? Winston lampooned in his heart. Winston, Amon, and Zarhan were standing in the line. They were somewhere in the 10 to 15 positions. Winston looked around himself, seeing all the different regulars in the place. In particular, his gaze kept drifting to the fragile-looking boy that stood with the overpowered weapon in hand. He was accompanied by a blue-haired boy and a crocodile. That's a member of the Kun family, Zarhan said from the side. Kun family? Winston narrowed his eyes. The Kun family? One of the 10 great families, Amon exclaimed, though only loud enough for it to be heard by his own teammates. Way to go, Amon, Winston cheered in his heart. That's right. Kun family people are all known for having blue hair and dark blue eyes. Zarhan eyed the blue-haired boy cautiously. Supposedly, they're also quite talented in matters of Shinsa manipulation in the form of ice and lightning. Then, he shrugged his shoulders. I don't know though. Just rumors I heard. Wow, there are such people climbing the tower. Amon widened his eyes in amazement before he adopted a serious expression. Then, he balled his hand into a fist and looked at it with a gaze of steel. Winston looked at him but didn't say anything. Instead, he focused on the blue-haired boy. 10 great families, huh? Interesting. Just then, a scream echoed in the air. Arg! A scream. Is the test so dangerous? That sounds painful. Plethora of comments echoed in the quiet hall. The regulars seemed worried for the most part. Winston narrowed his eyes and looked at the time on his pocket. 9:42, it read. There's an imposed 10 minutes timer to the entire thing. If you can't complete the test within 10 minutes, the regulars will fail. However, it must not just be a completion task. If it was that, there would be no screams right up until the end of the timer, which would mean that the regulars failed to complete it. Instead, it would be more accurate to judge it as an objective task, in which a certain action needs to be completed from a group of actions. Winston remembered the group that went inside previously. If I remember correctly, the previous group completed the test in only a minute, which might suggest that the right task that is to be performed is particularly easier than all the others. But that is all pure speculation. Time elapsed. More teams went inside and screams flew out of the test room. Some teams passed and some didn't. While it was happening, Winston noticed the same pattern. It happened again. Before long, it was their turn. The test will begin after you open the door beyond this one. I shall open this door for you, the woman said. With that she opened the door. As Zarhan pushed open the next door, they walked into a pitch-black dark room. Ads by Pub Future. There were 12 doors in total in both sides of the room. In the center, before what looked to be traditional Japanese-style shoji doors, a beautiful woman was seated with a teacup in hand. However, welcome regulars. My name is Han-Sung Yu, your next test administrator. The voice of a man echoed in the room. Winston looked at him in surprise. He's a man? Han-Sung spoke. The test is quite simple. The 12 doors you see on the sides, you need to choose the right one out of all of them. He smiled. If you find the real door and open it, you will pass the test. If you don't, you will die, he said tersely. What type of test is this? Zarhan yelled. Is it not to your liking? Well, can't do anything about it. The test starts now. He clapped his hands. Wait. At least give us some clues. Zarhan yelled again. The clues have already been provided. Han-Sung replied. Hearing his words, Winston's mind went into a brainstorm. The clues have been provided, n/o/vel/b/jn.c//om. He ignored the tantrum Zarhan was throwing and Amon, who was freaking out. The only clues I can figure out are the time limits and the scream. The test was not an objective task choosing, but simply a multiple choice question. He looked above where a giant clock was erected. Then, he looked at the timer on his pocket. 1:23. With that, he compared the timing of the clock with his pocket. It's a 5-minute timer? Winston exclaimed in his mind. Just then, Zarhan grabbed his collar. Oi, do something. Have I ever told you that between you and me, one of us is smarter than you? Winston asked him quizzically. Huh. Zarhan's expression turned confused. And then, it morphed into one of anger. What the hell did you say? I'm not good at this shit. Solve it already, he screamed. Amon didn't say anything on the side, just looking around nervously, as if in deep thought. Winston went and put his hand on his shoulder. Don't overthink it, he said. Huh? Mr. Winston? He asked in puzzlement. Winston smiled and nodded mysteriously. Then, he walked to the center of the hall. Han-Sung, who was sitting from some distance to the center, quietly sipped his tea. Walking to the center, he grabbed Zarhan's spear from him and placed its butt on the ground. Just for confirmation, he smiled. Then, closing his eyes, he began to chant. The right door for the test. Ads by Pub Future. The right door for the test. The right door for the test. The right door for the test. Muttering it 3 times, he let go of the spear. Then, the spear stood still without moving. 5 seconds passed and the spear didn't move. Did it not work? Zarhan asked in confusion. It most certainly did, replied Winston, throwing his spear back at him. Then, walking to one of the doors, Winston placed his hand on it and pushed it open. The timer on the pocket showed 3:28. Then, all the doors became green and the sound of clapping was heard. Clap, 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 clap. Congratulations, you passed the test, Han-Sung said, smiling at them. Both Zarhan and Amon said at the same time. You pass, Han-Sung said tersely. Then, he scanned the figures of the 3 regulars. The goal of the test was simply to open a door within the first 5 minutes. Although the time provided was 10 minutes, even you has exceeded the given time limit, Each door which would otherwise lead to the outside would turn into doors of death. He closed his eyes and sipped from the teacup. Let's go, said Winston, walking right out of the door. Wait for us, Amon said, running behind him. Zarhan took one last look at Han Sung-yu before also running along. How did you figure it out? Amon asked, perching up behind him. Yeah, that spear trick didn't work. Zarhan spoke, surprisingly not shouting. It didn't matter which door I picked, it was simply a test of resolve and willfulness to act. As long as any door was picked within 5 minutes, we would have passed. Winston said. The administrator already said that. How did you reach that conclusion? Zarhan inquired. It was simply a matter of elimination. The administrator said that all the clues were provided, that being the time limit, the screams and the clock at the top. Any other conclusion could never logically be confirmed from the amount of clues given. He finished. I deduced something similar but wasn't sure to act on it. Amon admitted from the side. Then he scratched the back of his head and smiled awkwardly. I got too nervous. Winston narrowed his eyes slightly and chuckled. No worries. You'll eventually learn to get through any test you can come across, he said. Then, his slightly gazed at Zarhan who was walking beside him, his otherwise silly and flamboyant expression now turned still. Both of them are somewhat logical thinkers. Well, one is smarter than the other. Winston nodded slightly, unbeknownst to his teammates. Amon smiled at Winston's reassuring words and didn't say anything else. Soon, Zarhan also returned to his cheerful temperament. Ads by Pub Future, what a ridiculous test. Even a kid could solve it, he declared. Both Winston and Amon laughed a bit. After the test was done for all the regulars, they were given a short rest, of about 30 minutes. All the regulars were gathered in yet another hall. This one had strange contraptions that looked eerily similar to vending machines. Winston stood in front of one with Amon. He quietly observed the variety of food and drinking items displayed on the machine. Do you have any points? Winston whispered. No. Amon whispered back. Is there a way to steal it? Winston looked around. Immediately, he could easily spot many of the things that could be stolen on all of the regulars' bodies. However, unfortunately for him, points were mostly a digital thing stored in their pockets. Momentarily, he marveled at the marauder's sense of thievery and the dexterity of his hands that itched to try something. However, he suppressed the urge, for now. What about Zarhan? He said he comes from a hunter tribe. They don't use things like points because it doesn't have any use for them. Winston nodded reluctantly at the explanation. He looked at Zarhan who stood alone at one end of the hall, some distance from the vending machine they stood in front of. Just then, Winston sensed movement to his side. He turned and looked. It was the same boy with the sword. The boy looked nervous as he observed the contents in the vending machine. Does he have any points? Winston mused. The boy tried to tap on the vending machines like Winston had just 3 minutes prior, before being told by Amon about the points system. Ah, you need points for that? Winston said, trying to talk to the boy. The boy looked at him, his brown and innocent eyes reflecting the figure of a dark-haired man that had hazel-colored eyes. Points? He asked in puzzlement. It's a currency system in the tower. It is used universally to transactions. He replied. I'm Winston by the way. This is Amon. He pointed to Amon behind him. Ah, sorry? My name is 25th Bam? It's the day I was born. Bam explained. Bam, huh? Since he doesn't know about the point system, does he also come from an isolated community? Winston wondered. Then, his gaze wandered slightly to the sword that was wrapped in bandages. He hurriedly tore off his eyes lest the boy noticed them. Nice to meet you, Bam. Nice to meet you. Amon said from behind him. Nice to meet you too, Mr. Winston. Mr. Amon. Bam exclaimed with a pleased smile. Winston looked at him with a smile. Is he really so trusting or is it simply expression control? Winston wondered, not understanding the boy. His expression was too honest and trusting, appearing somewhat eerie in a place such as the floor of tests, where everyone could potentially be your enemy. It must be deception, Winston concluded. As they were talking, someone appeared beside them. It was a normal-looking person with dimples on his cheeks and close-cropped hair. He wore a purple jumpsuit and appeared to be about 180 centimeters or 6 feet high. Chapter 10, Crown Game Money Mode. The man said. His pocket appeared beside him and he tapped on the small screen that was before the vending Machine. The screen turned green. Ding, and with that, the drink Bem had tapped for went down. The man picked it up and handed it to the boy. Here's the drink you were getting. He smiled. Hey, buy us a drink as well? Winston lampooned with a sour expression. It seemed to him that they would not get along well. The name's Shivisu, he said. Seems that you passed as well, lucky boy. Then he turned towards Winston and Amon. And so did you guys. Nice to meet you. Winston nodded at him. A pleasure. My name is Winston. You can call me Amon. Amon said from behind Winston. Shivisu nodded. You want drinks as well? They bonded quickly. After getting the drinks, Shivisu talked to Bam's teammates. Winston and Amon went back towards Zarhan, who wanted to snatch some of Winston's drink. Give me it, he yelled. No way. Get your own, you brokey, Winston said in a mocking tone. You. Please stop. Amon also yelled from the side. As their antics continued, a familiar person arrived into the hall. Attention all regulars, Luro said, entering the room. His declaration managed to stop Zarhan from obsessing over a canned drink as their team turned to look at the ranker. I come bearing good news, he said. Good news? A voice asked among the crowd. That's right. We will give you all a chance to partake in a game. Luro smiled. No, that's not advantageous to us at all, Shivisu replied from the other side of the hallway. Any extra tests will only be disadvantageous. Luro shook his head and chuckled. You misunderstand. You are free to not take the test. There is absolutely no penalty for you to do so. Then, his eyes scanned the regulars. However, the winning team of the game will be allowed to ascend to the next floor without taking any of the tests that would be conducted later down the line on the test floor. As his words landed, silence descended onto the hall. Every regular's attention was piqued, looking intently at Luro. So, does that seem advantageous? Luro smiled. Before long, everyone that wanted to partake in the test was taken of their respective rooms, each of which was further connected to a collective hall that was at least 70 meters in diameter. Ads by Pub Future. Winston, Amon, and Zarhan stood in their own cell, overlooking the hall that the game as Luro described would be conducted in. The entire hall was painted a thick color of yellowish gold, the like morning streaks of light that scattered across the infinite sky into 1,000 more shades. The golden color was deeply reminiscent of the sun that shone with the color of steel as it rose from oblivion, the place where ground and sky connected into one. At the center of the hall, a gigantic throne was erected, also plated in a thick golden color. Atop the sole seat of the throne, which seemed to be capable of holding at least 10 people, sat a lonesome golden crown, too majestic to tear one's eyes off of. Now that you've all been transported here, I will explain the crown game to you. The tall human, the ranker Luro said, taking the crown from the throne. It was unknown at which point he had ended up there, or perhaps he had always stood at that place, one couldn't tell. The crown game, in short, is a game to steal the crown, he continued. The team that holds the crown at the end wins the game. That might appear simple at first glance, but the rules are complicated. The first is the time limit. He put the crown atop his head. The game will be conducted in 5 rounds, each 10 minutes long. Only 5 teams can participate in a round at once. Once a team succeeds in holding the crown, they pass the round and proceed to the next one. In the next round, 4 teams will enter and will compete for it with the team that passed the previous round, which will now defend the crown. The team that manages to hold the crown in the last round wins the crown game. Luro spread out his arms. Also, there is a way to finish the rounds early, which is to sit on the throne with the crown on your head. His hand pointed to the crown he held on his head. He sat down on the throne. However, there is a movement in restriction. The member of the team that sits on the throne will not be permitted to stand up from it. If they do under any circumstances, their team will lose the round and the next would begin. If such a thing happens in the last round, the game will be terminated with no winners. FYI, the participation is on a first-come first-serve basis. There is a buzzer on the walls of each of your cells, he said. Winston looked at the red buzzer at the wall of their cell and nodded. Pressing the buzzer will get you your place in the round. Again, the participation is strictly on a first-come first-serve basis. Luro smiled. He took off the crown on his head and kept it back on the throne. Then participation in the early rounds is clearly disadvantageous. We should opt to steal the crown in the later stages. That would be easier. Amon said suddenly. That makes sense. Zarhan scratched his chin. Correct. Luro yelled. He heard that? Winston appeared a bit shocked. However, doing so would endanger your spot in the later stages. If you postpone participation because of the risk, you won't even be able to participate in the later game. Don't overthink it, you just have to steal the crown. Luro whispered, yet audible enough to reach their ears. Hearing the word steal, Winston's ears perked up. A chance to act. He thought excitedly. A crown, certainly it carries value, I can tell just by observing from here. A marauder's sense of worldly belongings is really something. And considering all the spectators and even the rancor, it should serve as great feedback. Winston grinned, pleased at the possibility. Then, we will be beginning shortly. A 5-minute buffer time is given. Good luck to all regulars, he said. Ah, I almost forgot. A team from another test site will be joining the game. Winston's eyes narrowed to some extent. Another test site? Then, let us begin with the game, he said and disappeared. Which round should we go in? Zarhan turned to Winston and asked. I don't know, you tell me. Winston smiled at him. Zarhan and Amon adopted confused expressions. Winston sighed. He quieted down for some time, probably around 20 seconds. Zarhan and Amon didn't say anything, acutely aware that Winston was devising up a strategy. Either the third round or the fourth. Winston concluded. Although going in on the second one is also not too bad of an option. He smiled. But won't that endanger our winning chances in the long run? Amon asked. To the side, the spear-bearing man also crossed his arms and tilted his head. Tisk tisk tisk. That's incorrect. Winston looked towards the throne. It's actually a trap. There's less chance for the latter teams to win than there is for the starting teams. Seeing their expressions still marred in confusion, Winston explained. Think of it like this. There's 5 hungry people in a room. One of them has something to eat. Only one person can eat it. Winston turned to them. The other people will not only have to compete with the holder of the eatable but also with the others that are willing to fight for it. In the same way, once someone gets seated on the throne, it isn't just a rat race any longer. They wouldn't want some other team to get the crown now, would they? That makes sense? That's why Mr. Luro said to simply steal the crown and not overthink it. Amon yelled in enlightenment. Zarhan's brows furrowed for a moment before he nodded. Then that means we should go in the second round. He yelled. Fate is an elusive lady, Winston said suddenly. We never know when an opportunity may arise. For now, information is needed. It seems Winston had still yet to master the true artistry of being a charlatan. Before long, the crown game officially started. Luro counted down from 5 and upon reaching 0, the first round began. Trrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr Winston smashed his ring finger and thumb together, vying to get a better gauge of the participants. N/O/vel/b/in.c//om. Wait. That's... Winston's eyes widened in surprise as he gazed at the whirlpool of shinso that centered around the dark green hook. The holder of the weapon, the green-skinned lizard girl, Anake, calmly walked in front of her teammates in long strides. Shivisa's team. Amon said. Indeed. Anake, Hatsu, and Shiviso walked towards the other team of regulars without a care in the world. Anake said something to her teammates and strode forth by herself. Her teammates didn't follow. She's going to take them on herself? Winston's interest was piqued. One of the regulars from the other team rushed at her. Anake, simply using her palm, smashed ads by Pub Future his jaw. Bam! Whoosh! Quiet. The entire hall quieted down. The regular, after being hit with Anake's palm right in the jaw, flew to the other side or the hall and slammed himself into the wall. A feat of strength that was unlike anything that Winston could personally hope to mimic, at least. Not at Sequence 9. Winston looked wide-eyed at the spectacle. What absurd strength! That sort of strength is something I can only hope to achieve at the mid-sequences. Without delay, the remaining two regulars rushed at her. And that was when Anake unfurled the strength of her weapon. With a swing of her hand, the green hook in her hand elongated like a metallic whip, ruthlessly smashing right into the other regular. Whip! Smash! With a smash, the regulars was sent 10 meters into the air and then slammed right into the ground. The other regular, taking advantage of the distraction, punched her right in the temple. Bam! What the dash? The regular's surprised voice echoed in the hall. He had managed to hit her right in the temple, however, he had failed to cause any sort of discomfort, or even movement of her head. Anak turned her head and looked at him. So the lizard has a rock for a head, Zarhan whispered from the side. My hand. The regular screamed as he clutched his bald hand, right before getting flicked in the face with the green hook and thrown back. Get the crown? Follow me. The regular that had been smashed into the ground got up and tried to run for the crown, as did his two other teammates who had also gotten up. Without any trouble, they quickly passed Anak. What is she doing? Winston muttered imperceptibly to himself. However, just as they got close to the throne, someone jumped atop it. Holding the green hook in her hand, it extended beyond the throne and she spun it around with great strength. Bam! 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 The whip-like weapon hit them all square in the chest, throwing them back and knocking them out for good. Then, without any reason and ignoring her teammates, the lizard sat down onto the throne and adorned the crown onto her head, appearing like a princess sitting atop her throne. Chapter 11, Crown Game 2. As the lizard girl, Anak, sat onto the throne, the first round of the crown game came to a conclusion. There was some discourse among the team. Members of the winning team and Shivisu argued with the test administrator about the rules, subject to whether the switching of people who wore the crown within a team was allowed. Such things were obviously stretching the rules a bit too thin, and so it was denied. The lizard girl is on the throne now. It's our chance. Zarhan yelled from the side, screaming right into Winston's ears. Winston scowled at him and shook his head. No, now is not the time, he said. Why? Although her weapon can extend, she clearly won't be able to fight as freely now. Hearing his words, Winston glared at the one seated on the throne. More specifically, he glared at her weapon. You don't understand. We should still wait. Yes, we must wait. A smirk made its way onto his face. Only then can I steal the crown and digest the potions. We're gonna have to go into the field at some point, Amon said, fidgeting nervously. Winston nodded at his words. For some reason, amid the tests, Winston, as the most intellectually sane, had been tactically deemed to be the leader of their group, or at least the one whose opinion held the most weight. Winston smiled at them. And that we will. He glanced again at the weapon, and then his eyes drifted to the crown atop her head. We shall steal the crown right under everyone's eyes. For that, we must wait. As Winston understood it, the true might of the weapon had not been unleashed as of yet. Although he felt that in the hands of a stronger being it might prove to be stronger, it stood to reason that Winston was cautious. It was better to be as such, than to suffer the consequences after underestimating the other party's capabilities. For Winston, overestimating his competition was considered better than underestimating them. Then, the second round will begin shortly. Press your buzzers by the time I count down from 5. Luro's announcement rang out, echoing in the hall and in the cells. 5, 4, 3. As the countdown continued, none of their participants rose to press the buzzer. Winston, Amon, and Zarhan calmly observed the hall, looking for the teams that would be participating. 2, 1. Eighth. A sharp alarm rang out and the doors opened up for the next batch of teams. Ads by Pub Future. 4 teams walked up into the arena, each containing people more eccentric than the other. One of them has a single red eye atop a stone-like head, the other had bat-like wings on his back. One of them slept in a full bed mattress and the other had 2 sets of arms. Amon and Zarhan moved closer to the gate where Winston was standing, opting to get a better look at the game. At first, there was some discord among the participating teams as they contemplated whether they were to simply attack without plan or collude together for the taking down of Shivisu's team. Team up? Heh, yeah right. Winston guffawed in his heart, lampooning together as he did so. In a game such as this, where the stakes were the ascendancy to the next floor and where life and death were on the line, no one was willing to trust each other. It was basic common sense. One wouldn't want to share their worldly riches with others, no matter how much in need the other person was. And when the need becomes universal, the ground that one stands on becomes a battlefield. There is no rest for the wicked. There is only the next battlefield in the tower. That much was already clear to Winston, to someone who had not entered the tower a day ago and someone that had yet to figure out the intricacies that went along with climbing it. As expected, 2 of the 3 teams that participated began to fight among themselves, while the other 2 swarmed the 2 fighting members of the winning team, Hats and Shivisu. Shivisu got the team with the sleeping man, making things a bit easier for him as he wasn't facing a 3 versus 1 situation. For Hats, it was still manageable because of the gap in strength and skill. Subpar at best. Zarhan muttered from the side. Both Winston and Amon glanced at him from the corner of their eyes. Zarhan's eyes were deeply riveted to the fights going on, intently scanning each and every single participant. Just 2 people are troublesome here. He whispered to himself again, yet it was still heard by the other 2. His grip on his spear tightened. In the arena, Shivisu was quickly overwhelmed by the 2 members of the opposing team and was then saved by Hats, who had taken care of his own opponents. However, something peculiar happened very quickly. The sleeping man who was enveloped by the mattress began to get up, propping up his chest and sitting with the throne on front. Then, he gently held out his hand in front of him. Winston's eyes widened in shock and expectation. Without delay, he tapped his ring finger and thumb together twice in succession, activating his spirit vision. Immediately, his vision was filled by waves that existed everywhere. In the hand of the sleeping man, a bright ball of light began to gather. And then, with a glorious speed, the light rushed towards Anak, who was sleeping quietly on the throne. Who? The light enveloped the tiny figure of Anak, or was at least supposed to. The green lizard jumped atop the throne, the crown still adorned on her head. As she landed, she tried to glare at the perpetrator, only to be met with another attack right there. This one hit her head on, enveloping her without any room to escape. Anak! Shivisu yelled as he ran towards the throne, following behind the 2 members of the opposing team who were vying for the crown. The lady and the guy with the horn jumped to attack Anak, who had emerged from the attack mostly unharmed. A wave controller, Amon said quizzically, which prompted Zarhan to nod. Wave controller? Winston mused. Contemplating for a bit, he linked the term wave controller with the term Shinsu user he had heard before. He was not sure if they were quite the same, however, since the sleeping man had used the waves around him, Shinsu, Winston felt that they might largely be the same, albeit having some differences, hence, the need for having different descriptions. If they manage to snatch the crown, we'll have a harder time competing for it. Amon quipped. Winston narrowed his eyes, deciding not to comment on a topic he was not sure if he had sufficient information on. Back in the arena, a soft voice echoed. Unlike you, I can use Shinsu to attack, meaning I don't have the limitation of distance when facing you, the man said. Give up. There is no competition. I can attack the throne from anywhere, he declared with a voice high and mighty, yet laced with a lazy undertone. Anak clicked her tongue, a glare marring her childlike face. At the moment, she seemed more like an acolyte of rage than anything else that could be useful for her description. Attack the throne from anywhere, you said, she quipped. Then, she twirled the gigantic green hook in her hand into the air. Winston turned off his spirit vision, feeling the glow of the weapon getting brighter still. Ignition, she whispered, her voice reaching the ears of every regular present somehow, blossoming a strange sense of foreboding in their hearts. An ignition weapon, Zarhan screamed, holding the railing in front of him, almost wanting to jump out of the cage. Ignition weapon? Amon inquired, never having heard to the term. Winston cheered inside his heart at Amon's question. Alas, they would not get the time for a discussion. Just as they were wondering, the situation in the arena changed drastically. The weapon in her hand, which had stood at a mere 3 meters in length before extended to a staggering 50 meters, towering over everyone like a gigantic behemoth. Nov. L.B//JNN. Anak held a crazy smile on her face, her lips stretched from ear to ear with teeth fully showing, appearing incredibly psychopathic. She swung her weapon, slamming it right into the ground where the sleeping man had previously say. What the hell? Zarhan yelled. Ads by Pub Future. Amon stood flabbergasted at the display, his eyes widened to the extreme. Winston himself did not fare any better. How the hell am I gonna steal the crown from that? His eyes narrowed and his lips turned a bit dry. Sweat appeared on his forehead at the relentless barrage of attacks that was being thrown in the ring. Anak with her gigantic weapon slammed into the ground over and over, trying to hit the man covered in the bed mattress. The man in bed, strangely floated into the air, flying about everywhere dodging her attacks desperately. Even a single one could be fatal. His expression was a mixture of anxiety, surprise, and concentration. Then, Anake's green weapon again underwent a change. The gigantic hook which had been flailing around in the air split itself into dozens of other whip-like extensions, each seemingly with a mind of its own. It felt as if a living creature was writhing from the ground up, wanting to kill, destroy, and swallow any living thing it could possibly get its feeling tentacles on. The weapon like an instrument of destruction tore through the air, rushing straight at the 3 other people remaining in the battlefield. Anake laughed like a deranged fairy book beast, descended from the unknown beyond to purge the world from all life. The thing can split? Winston looked on, getting increasingly shocked from the battle. At that moment, even Zarhan, who exclaimed at the battle since arrival, was quieted down, opting to simply observe. Amon nervously watched, unwilling to make a comment upon seeing the concentrated gazes that his other 2 teammates had on the battlefield. However, just when it felt as if it was the end for the other team, something clicked. Anake stopped, the weapon automatically retracting itself into the previous 3-meter hook. She turned towards one of the cages abruptly, simply staring at the air as if bewitched. Taking advantage of the momentary distraction, the team rushed out, reaching back to their own cage. By the rules, return to their respective cage meant elimination from the crown game. Way to go! Shivasu cheered, looking at the figure of Anake who stood at the top of the throne still. However, just as he was doing so, Anake, who had been quiet, leapt from the throne towards a cage. Boom! Unknowingly, relief washed over Winston as he remembered the rules. Leaving the throne for any reason whatsoever means elimination from the crown game for the team. Chapter 12, Crown Game, 3 13-month series? Jihad's daughter? Black March and Green April? Winston muttered inside his brain, failing to comprehend the topics and falling behind in the conversation that was being carried out. Strangely, even though the cage Anake had bombarded was at the other side of the arena, Winston and his teammates were able to hear them without problem. Winston secretly stole a glance at the expression of his 2 other teammates, who seemed more surprised than confused. So she's a princess of Jihad. No wonder she was so strong. Amon said aloud. Zarhan quipped along, and she has the Green April no less, one of the weapons crafter personally by Ashal Eduardo and bestowed by King Hahas himself to the princesses. He said. Inwardly, Winston became more confused than anything. King Jihad? There's a king to the tower? And this Ashal guy? Interesting. Winston nodded to himself. But isn't the 13-month series weapons only meant to be bestowed to ranker? How could a regular on the floor of tests have it? Amon inquired, looking towards Winston. I knew it was weird for an ignition weapon of such caliber to be on the test floor. Zarhan screamed from the side. That's what I was wondering. Winston closed his eyes and nodded sagely. More importantly, he pointed. What about that boy who holds the Black March? Don't you think that's even weirder? Having listened to the conversation Anake and the other team had, he had been made keenly aware that anyone else aside from the princesses of Jihad, much less a man, was not supposed to be able to get such weapons. Amon's expression turned thoughtful. Didn't he mention Yuri Jihad? Does she have a connection to Bam? He mused. Winston's eyes turned a bit misty. He didn't know who Yuri Jihad was? How was he expected to continue the conversation? Simple. He wasn't. That wouldn't matter now, would it? He glanced at the arena again. I think we'll be participating in the 4th or the final round, Winston declared. Soon, the 3rd round began. Luro counted down from 5, and with that the 3rd round of the crown game officially began. Bam's team participated in the 3rd round. 4 other teams participated alongside them, all vying for the crown within haste. However, the blue-haired boy, Kun, as Winston had heard his name was, showed incredible wit and planning capabilities, effortlessly fooling all the regulars that participated. He's dangerous, Winston mused, narrowing his eyes. His eyes also wandered to the small bag he held in his hand, Manbarandana, it was called. Incredible feats of cunning and not too shabby in combat himself. Bam doesn't seem to be too troublesome, but his weapon might prove to be the most bothersome thing of all. Then, his eyes overtook the gigantic mass, the hulking crocodile that was in their team. Rakwraith Razor. Kun is adept at combat, yet his excellence is in his cunning. The crocodile is particularly hard to handle. His skill in handling the spear seems too troublesome to deal with. Winston racked his brain, trying to think of a viable plan for the situation. His eyes wandered towards his equipment, which included a steel broadsword and a bow and some arrows. He sighed. I might need to experiment a bit with ritualistic magic after this, never know when charms could come in handy. He shook his head, focusing on the situation at hand. Logically speaking, with a team of their strength level, most competent teams would choose to participate in the last round. And as of now, only 6 teams are left for participation, meaning there's no trouble of not getting a spot in the last round. The general level of strength of the regulars can be handled. Regulars like the crocodile and then lizard seem to be rare exceptions. And since it will be the last round, all the teams will be agitated and fight amongst themselves. Suddenly, it all clicked in Winston's mind. If we manage to snatch the crown in the 4th round, holding the throne in the last one would be easier than snatching it amid the chaos. For a moment, Winston remembered Klein the fool who made use of chaos as an escape route. But there's no telling what might happen in such a chaotic situation. Too risky. I can't miss out on the opportunity. Ads by Pub Future. Winston shook his head and looked towards his teammates, who at this point were also looking at him intently, waiting for him to make a decision. We'll participate in the 4th round, Winston declared as if a king commanding his subjects. A smile graced his lips. Finally, some action. Zarhan yelled, spinning around the spear in his hand. On the other hand, Amon looked a bit nervous, his figure fidgeting under his clothes. And just in time, Luro started the count. All regulars who wish to participate in the next round, press the buzzer within 5 seconds. Winston looked towards the arena with a smile, thinking of the possible courses of actions he could take to snatch the crown. However, at that moment, his eyes caught a strange detail. Kun took out a piece of blue cloth from his bag and tied his hair back, making a small ponytail out of his otherwise free-flowing blue hair. What? Winston, for some odd reason, felt weirded out. Kun had clearly shown himself plenty capable of combat without tying his hair back. Why would he do so now? At that moment, he felt something was wrong. The countdown reached 3. Seeing Zarhan, who was about to press the button, Winston quickly leapt up and held his arm in an iron grip. Wait. What could be the reason? His eyes scanned Kun's figure once again, then, his eyes landed on the bag. Wait a minute, his eyes narrowed. It's possible for living things to be shrunk and stored as well? Remembering the blob-like being getting sucked into the bag, something clicked. What are ye doing? Zarhan yelled, tearing his arm away from Winston's grasp. We won't be participating, Winston said, his expression dead serious as he looked at the leisurely Kun who sat alongside Bam on the throne. Why? Amon said. He had already taken out a short and was ready to fight if needed be. Just intuition, Winston said. His thoughts could be wrong, but things that could fire off the intuition of a Beyonder were not to be ignored. Intuition warnings were hidden information from the surrounding spirit world, if such a thing even existed in the place known as the Tower. Winston didn't know, but he knew better than to simply ignore such a thing. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. We'll just participate in the next round, he said with conviction. Zarhan clicked his tongue in annoyance while Amon returned the short sword into its sheath. Taini. The alarm sound rang out and the teams were taken out of their cages. 3 teams participated in the 4th round. The 3 teams, like the previous rounds, tried to collude together to take down the current team occupying the throne. However, something unexpected happened. One of the teams attacked the other. Ads by Pub Future. The other team, having not expected such things to happen, fell down quickly, putting up little resistance. All while Kun himself, along with Bam, sat on the throne in leisure. The remaining team tried to go for the crown, however, it seemed that they were plenty weaker than the crocodile, with all 3 of them having been defeated in mere moments. As the happenings in the arena concluded, Amon and Zarhan looked at Winston with widened eyes. How did you know? Amon asked in amazement. That's the neat part. I didn't. Winston smiled. What kind of nonsense is that? Zarhan expressed his doubts. Hearing his words, Winston simply shrugged. I have keen observation skills, he said. Yeah, right. Zarhan snorted, his scowl clearly expressing his thoughts on the matter. Winston could do nothing but shake his head. It was truly due to his keen sense of observation and derivation of information that the Marauder potion provided him that he had been able to even notice the small signs of strangeness with Kun. As for how his mind could even cook up the exact situation with such accuracy, Winston could not say. Perhaps it was the surrounding spirit world or whatever passed for that here helping him with the revelations. Intuition is a scary ability, he mused. Soon, the other team headed back to their cell without any want to fight with Bam's team, making them progress to the final 5th round. Well, that's our cue, Winston said. You sure? Zarhan quipped sarcastically. Positive. Winston chuckled. And then, as Luro announced for the teams to press their buzzers, his hand moved towards it. 5. What's our plan of action? Amon asked suddenly, his disposition a mix of nervousness and conviction. 4. Winston pressed the buzzer, still having his eyes glued to the arena. This time, he didn't sense any sort of discomfort. However, there was a sense of foreboding he felt. Simple, he said. 3. Use the chaos to your advantage. With the small fishes gone, the sharks will be arriving at the ads by pub future last stage. He smiled. 2. The more fighting that ensues, the better will be the chances to steal the crown. Suddenly, he looked behind him at Zarhan. Can you take the crocodile? He asked. 1. Zarhan grinned. Damn right, I can. Taiyeen. With the sharp sound of the alarm, the door to their cage slowly swung open, spraying some smog into the cage. You guys, Winston continued, walking out of the cage. The steel broadsword was flung over his shoulder and the bow and the quiver was attacked to his back through a cloth strap. With eyes flashed for a moment as he tapped his ring finger and thumb twice. Just need to make an opening. A cold expression appeared on his face as his eyes met that of Kunz. Winston smiled at him in challenge.n/o/vel/b//n.c//om. I'll steal the crown myself, he declared. Luro sat in his lighthouse that floated atop the entire arena, quietly overlooking the crown game. The inside of his lighthouse was bathed in a golden glow, deeply reminiscent of the evening sun. His eyes were focused as he looked on at the participants of the current round. A princess of Jihad, an irregular and an unknown regular all together in the same team. Then there's Kun and his 2 teammates. And finally, as his words drifted, his eyes riveted themselves to the figure of a tall young man with black hair. Winston Heath. That boy gives me a strange feeling. I can't quite put my finger on it, as he observed the man. Suddenly, he felt something click as he walked into the arena. There it is again, that feeling. That strangeness. Suddenly, he shook his head. The tower is indeed a large place. Many regulars with strange abilities can arise. He continued, speaking to himself. Then, how far will this badge go, I wonder? He said. For some unknown, inexplicable reason, he suddenly remembered a quote from a certain friend of his. A very frivolous princess to be precise. Everything in the tower, I say, everything in the tower is subject to change. That is the only thing that will last forever in the tower. Unconsciously, a smile blossomed on his face. Chapter 13, Crown Game. 4. Silence. Silence reigned in the arena for a moment, deafening to the point that even a pin drop could be heard. Rak and Kun stood at the 2 sides of the throne, ready to leap at a moment's notice in protection of their 3rd teammate. Winston looked around, reading the flow of the waves with his spirit vision. Zarhan moved before him, spinning his spear in the air. This time, there was no team left that wanted to collude. Every other team that held less ability had already been eliminated. Winston's eyes scanned his competition. 3 people in cloaks stood at the opposite end of the arena. Another team stood to the right, consisting of a woman in a mask and a tight spandex and 2 other men, one with 4 arms and the other with a single crystal for his eye. And finally, to the right of the previous team, stood another team of regulars. Time stood still for a moment. Nobody moved. And then, something clicked. Whoosh! Winston and Zarhan rushed forward, the wind breaking behind them. Amon followed from the side, going towards the left. At the same instant, the woman in the spandex moved with precision. The metallic staff she held in her hand, seemingly heavier than 20 kgs, was twirled around effortlessly in the air as she moved towards the other team to her left. Winston's eyes dropped on the staff colored in gold for a moment, his marauder powers instantly calculating the value of the staff. Then, his figure approached Rak. Ray! The gigantic crocodile screamed with power as he smote down his red spear towards us, aiming to impale us in a single swoop. Winston quickly jumped to the right, avoiding the attack altogether before it could even reach them. Zarhan propped up his spear before him and deflected the spear to the right. To the side, Winston, having rolled over, came face to face with Kun. Chung! The sound of metal clashing was heard as a giant sword was pulled out from his bag, Manbarandana, and smashed wildly into Winston's broadsword. Winston felt his arms twist for a moment, before he realized what was happening. Quickly, he jumped back. He's well versed in sword fighting, twisting the opponent's strength against them to open up a striking point. Interesting. Winston smiled in delight. To the side, the woman in the spandex had already taken care of the other team. With that, her and her teammates rushed towards the throne. The crocodile was quickly surrounded by Zarhan and Aman. Although Aman wasn't able to help much considering the gap in strength, his weapon still proved to be a nuisance for the crocodile, allowing them to hold him off. Winston rushed back at Kun, this time in anticipation for his skills. A flurry of attacks was what followed soon after as both of them slashed at each other wildly, with none of them being able to get the advantage. Winston, with his spirit vision and instinctive fighting responses, was able to dodge all of his attack before they even got close. Meanwhile, Kun had his bag offer him protection. No matter how hard Winston seemed to hit it, it didn't budge a single inch. As they were engaging in their duel, Winston felt something jump over them, as testified by the change in the Shinso. Ads by Pub Future Huairl. The woman in the spandex effortlessly jumped almost 10 meters into the air, flipping her body while doing so. Then, holding her weapon, she took a stance and smashed wildly onto the unassuming figure that sat atop the throne. Bam! Bam! Kun screamed, a brief moment of distraction. And with that, Winston did not miss the mark. Taking his leg back, he embedded it deep into Kun's abdomen, throwing him back towards the throne. Black Turtle! The crocodile yelled, throwing away both Zarhan and Aman with a single sweep of his spear. However, just when the strike was about to connect, some metallic sounded. Clang! A giant disc, orange-black in color, floated soundlessly in the air, blocking her attack and throwing her nimble body back. She slid on the ground some distance from the throne and looked at the perpetrator. Rak, who had been rushing at the throne to save his teammate, was intercepted by the other two teammates of the spandex woman. In front of the spandex woman, a figure clad in a dark brown cloak suddenly appeared. Evidently, the figure was that of a woman. "You shouldn't take on someone in your own dimension, don't you think?" she said in a melodious voice. The masked woman didn't speak, only adopting a combat stance. Winston, on the other hand, while rushing towards the throne, was intercepted by a gigantic hulking mass, a figure clad in a brown robe, its face somewhat visible, which revealed dark red teeth, perhaps another mask underneath the cloak. The figure, wielding a cleaver in hand, smashed it down right onto Winston's figure, who was almost too slow to dodge. Shit! He cursed in his heart. Zarhan appeared behind him, stabbing with his spear. Clang! His spear slid off of the cleaver of the giant regular. However, at the last moment, he pushed his body forward and at the last moment, kicked the gigantic regular in the side, making his footing stumble for a moment. "Go, get the crown!" he screamed. Without wasting any time, Winston ran. Without a second of delay, he had already reached the crown just in front of the last elevation. With that, the situation came into view. Have they banded together? Why would they do so? Did that guy carry another team in his bag? Winston wondered, looking at the team of cloaked individuals protecting the other team. But the team with that masked woman is still with us? We can win? Winston cheered. Kun appeared before him, in his hand a short sword. Winston raised a brow and quickly began to counter. Just then, he realized something. If this goes on like this, we'll quickly run out of time. From the time the final round started, 4 minutes have already passed. Then, for some inexplicable reason, he remembered the test administrator, Luro Aro, and the sleeping bag man, who had used Shinso for their attacks, and the process for which he had seen completely with his spirit vision. Ads by Pub Future. It was support from his intuition. Compress? He yelled internally. Then, utilizing the basic principles of cogitation, his mind instantly stepped into a state of transcendent focus. And with that, a bright light flashed. A blinding flash of light illuminated the entire arena, momentarily blinding all the regulars. Kun, who was standing in front of him, closed his eyes. Winston looked beside him, a ball of shinsu had materialized, taking the form of a soft ball of light. For a split second, barely longer than the time it took one to blink their eyes, Winston felt something. A strange power flowing through him, filling him with strength unlike anything he had felt. It was something different from the sequence potion powers, something more malleable. Was that the right word? Then, as that feeling ended, he broke out of his short stupor. His eyes turned furious and then the ball of shinsu moved. Shay! Boom! Without any delay, the ball of shinsu moved to hit Kun. However, because of his unfamiliarity with the ball of shinsu, the ball impacted Kun's bag, throwing him back dozens of meters with a great explosion. Everyone's eyes turned towards Winston's figure for a moment, widened in surprise at the presence of a shinsu user. At that moment, Winston could have sworn he heard Zarhan yell, "I knew you were a shinsu user," in the background. At the back, taking advantage of the cloaked woman's distraction, who had, at this point, revealed her face, the woman with the mask jumped with all her strength right towards the throne. At the same time, Winston, who had no one to block him now, dashed at the throne, right towards Bam's figure, who was looking towards the cloaked figure towards his right. "Got you?" Winston grinned, extending his hand. Then, the spandex woman landed to his right. "What?" Bam! The metallic staff was blocked by his left arm, staggering him for a moment. "Turtle!" The crocodile yelled from behind. The masked woman didn't stop, wildly swinging her weapon towards the cloaked figure. "Strike!" The head of the cloaked figure was grazed, throwing off its cloak to reveal a young girl with freckles. Winston didn't stop and leapt forward without issue. However, just as he was about to grab the crown off of Bam's head, the waves around him ads by Pub Future grew restless. "Rachel!" he yelled, abandoning the throne and throwing himself towards the young woman. He left the throne. Winston's eyes widened as he adjusted his direction. His hand grabbed the crown off his head, just in time for him to intercept the metallic golden staff with his head of all places. Bam! And just as that happened, Winston felt something click inside of him, as if something was dissolving inside him, quickly transforming into beads of light that surrounded his soul and merged with it soon after. But Shay Duo? With the brief moment in which he relished in the feeling of a potion digestion, the shinsu in front of him changed suddenly. He ignored the masked woman's strike that was coming right for his face. His eye widened. Spurt! Blood spurted from his hand and from the face of the masked woman, each having been seemingly slashed with an invisible blade. A gigantic golden light enveloped them, centered around the boy who had just fallen down. Damn! Did the weapon react? Winston cursed in his mind, completely forgetting about the digestion of the potion and the crown entirely. Throwing himself back, he leapt out from the light, landing on the ground. Quickly, he turned and /o/vel/b/jn.c//om off his spirit vision because of the huge blend of colors he was constantly seeing moving in front of him. As the light finally subsided, there was silence in the entire arena. The masked woman clutched her right eye with her hands, sitting motionless on the floor, while Bam, the brown-haired boy, laid there atop the blonde-haired young girl, his hair stained crimson of his very own blood. Nobody moved, too shocked by the events that had just transpired. "Attention all regulars." Then Luro's voice broke then out of their thoughts. "The crown has been destroyed. And so, with the destruction of the crown game is also terminated." His words landed like a bomb atop their heads. Winston looked at the ground, where supposedly, the crown had been accidentally dropped because of his hand injury. There was nothing there, only empty air. Then, he looked at his hand. There was a deep gash, running from the middle of his middle and ring finger to somewhat into the middle of his hand. The adrenaline had blinked out the pain, making him not feel anything. "Well, there goes that," he sighed. Chapter 14, Digestion. The morning scintillating sun rose over the horizons. The glorious blazing ball of light illuminated the surroundings with an incandescent yellow hue. The gigantic building of the test floor floated in the air, its shadow stretched across the wheat and grass fields below for miles on end. The fields below were covered by a faint white mist, scattering the light of the refulgent sun. However, as Winston had just found out yesterday, the sun was not, in actuality, a sun. Instead, it was simply a ball of light that floated high up in the artificial atmosphere of the tower, which too was made out of shinsu. Winston got out of the bed, his hair sprawled all over his head and his eyes dazed over slightly. The curtains of his room, which were wide open, solely because he had forgotten to close them before going to sleep, filtered the soft morning rays of light into the room. Winston yawned and rubbed his right eye. Then, he got up and stretched his body. As he did, he could not help but savor the feeling of his joints and muscles opening up after a good night's rest. Then, he sighed. The Crown Games had ended right then and there. In a series of events Winston had honestly failed to see, the crown was utterly destroyed. He looked at the bandages on his right hand in thought, his mind overtaken with the visions of the naive boy he had met. The 25th BAM. Enigmatic he was. There were very few people that would throw themselves into dangerous situation to shield someone else. At least, Winston himself was not one of them. Then, he remembered how the previous day had gone over. Due to his injuries, he was taken to the infirmary by his teammates and spent the next 3 hours there. After that, his teammates escorted him to his room, despite his repeated insinuation that he was fine. Well, it is what is it. He shook himself out of his thoughts and went to freshen up. Every regular that had passed the tests and managed to survive the crown game with their full teams were allotted their own rooms. Each room had all the supplies one could hope for while living, save for a kitchen, the need for which was fulfilled by the cafeteria. It was also worth mentioning that the teams had also been disbanded by the time the crown game had ended, meaning there was little chance that he would take the next tests along with Zarhan and Aman. For all he could think, the next test might be an individual test. After he freshened up, he walked out of the door to his room and headed for the cafeteria. It was still 2 days for the next test to go. There was plenty which he could do to prepare for it. The first of which was to better familiarize himself with his abilities and gain resources which allow for full utilization of them. Although he had spent all his time in the cave to train his abilities, there was little he could do with the lack of materials. As he was lost in his thoughts, he felt someone approach from his back. Intuition is indeed a very useful ability. He turned back without delay, only to come face to face with Zarhan, his old teammate. "Yo," he greeted, throwing his hand into the air. Winston nodded. "Good morning." He smiled. "How'd you notice me?" "As a hunter, I make sure to be super quiet all the time," he inquired, getting closer. "Right." Winston gave him a judgmental stare for the slightest moment. "I just felt someone was behind me." Winston shrugged, a grin on his face. "TCH? Fine? Don't answer," he exclaimed, his face turning a bit sour. Winston nodded to himself, feeling a bit pleased. "Ads by Pub Future going to the cafeteria?" he asked. "Man's gotta eat," he said, tapping his stomach with a chuckle. With that, they both went towards the cafeteria, walking side by side. As they walked, they engaged in some small talk. "How's your arm?" "Feels fine. I guess it'll be all right in a few days," Winston answered, feeling a bit unsure himself. As of right now, he felt no actual discomfort in his arm. To be honest, it felt as if he hadn't even been hurt. "Does the shinsu speed up healing? I'll have to take off the bandages and see for myself," Winston mused. As they chatted, the cafeteria finally came into view. The cafeteria was a large hall, filled with various long tables and mundane decorations. The entire room was completely illuminated by lights on the ceiling, and coupled with the sunlight from the window walls, it left barely any room for shadows to be seen. To the far right, the food counter could be seen, operated by a yellowish humanoid behemoth with multiple eyes all around its head in a straight horizontal line. There were many people in the cafeteria at this point. Almost half of the regulars that had passed the tests and the crown game were here, making the cafeteria quite lively. As they walked to the food counter, someone called out to them, "Mr. Winston? Mr. Zarhan?" They looked towards one of the tables. It was Aman waving out to them. Winston waved back and Zarhan nodded tesly. Aman was already seated with a plate of edibles. And so, Winston and Zarhan took theirs and went on their way. Winston wasn't too knowledgeable about the cuisine, so he let Zarhan order for him as well. "The cafeteria using points is a bit unfair for us," Winston lampooned. "That's right. The cafeteria used points. Points were earned by passing tests and fulfilling certain quotas in them. Basically, a regular's performance determines how much points they get. Though it is practical." He shook his head, not thinking about it anymore. However, luckily for them, the crown game was not without its advantages. The participants, along with the starting number of points given to all the regulars, were given bonus points for their performance, meaning they were not the previous completely broke them, but now, the present less broke them. Taking their respective plates, they went ahead and sat down along with Amon. Good morning, Winston greeted. Good morning, Zarhan boisterously declared. Ads by Pub Future. Good morning to you too, Amon said enthusiastically. With that, they engaged in some conversations about the tests and tower, the idle chatter among the regulars. However, to Winston, it was free information. As someone that came from the outside, information was a must-have. Wow, you're very knowledgeable about these things, Zarhan droned with a subtle expression. His eyes appeared a bit lost. Yeah, Amon said, stuffing his mouth with food. You can find all sorts of things on the box. Winston raised a brow. The box? Amon stared at him. You don't know about the box, Mr. Winston, he exclaimed. Winston felt that he had messed up here. I seem to have heard about it, though I never bothered to find out about it, he replied with a relaxed tone. Oh, I see, he nodded. The box is a platform for all light bearers to sort through and share information about the tower. You can find practically anything on there, he explained. It's basically a blog for the light bearers. Winston appeared to be intrigued. How do you access this box? He asked. Just then, Zarhan broke out into a short laugh. Pfft, you don't even know how to access the box? Even I know that, he declared. You do, both Amon and Winston asked with a judgmental stare. Of course I do. It is accessed through lighthouses, those floating cubes-like things. Besides that, it can also be accessed through pockets, but the information is limited, he screamed. At that point, their table received a number of stares from the other regulars. Winston ignored these stares, so did his other two teammates. HP ZBook Firefly 35.6 cm, 14, G11. Mobile Workstation PC Intel Core Ultra 5 Processor. FreeDOS. 35.6 cm, 14, diagonal Wuxka display with Intel graphics. 16GB DDR5-5600 RAM. 512GB SSD solid. HP in ads by Pub Future. The rest of the breakfast went without any other interesting things being shared, yet still somewhat informative. The best thing about it was the box Amon had mentioned. Mentally, he decided to check it out upon returning to his room. Finishing the breakfast, as Winston reached his room, he took out a small pin-like object, blue in color. It was something he had stolen from Zarhan's attire. Although the other party wore casual clothing, his shirt held many small pin-like objects, blue in color. They were pretty to look at but not of significant monetary value, something he gleaned from his Marauder potion ability. As he sat down onto the bed, he could not help but look at this potion digestion again. Damn, no matter how I look at this, isn't this a bit too fast? He exclaimed in his heart. Yesterday, as he stole the crown, all of his potions, the seer, the marauder, and the apprentice, all of them had been digested almost to completion. If he had to put it into numbers, he would say that almost 97% of the potion had already been digested. He supported his arms with his legs and leaned forward in contemplation. In essence, it shouldn't be too out of the ordinary. After all, there were multiple people watching along with a ranker, a figure close to at least a high sequence, if not an angel. Winston concluded. Though it was hard to judge the level of rankers, he felt that they might be at the level of the demigods, with the upper echelons being at the level of angels. He sighed. The sequence 9 of the error pathway is called Marauder. In essence, it can be considered as a raider or a plundered, meaning the acting method for the sequence 9 should be reliant on feedback from others. If it was something like thief, then I may not have gotten the same result, considering as to how thieves are associated with secrecy and silence. Stealing a crown in front of such opposition and spectators turned out to be the optimal condition for acting. To be honest, the only reason that I can think of that I didn't digest the potion right then and there is because I didn't consolidate the acting principles of any potion. Winston felt it was possible. With the discovery of his rapid potion digestion, he also discovered that digestion was shared across all of his sequences. Meaning, if any digestion occurred on the seer potion, it would occur simultaneously on the other two potions as well. Meaning, if at any point he hit a wall in the digestion of any one potion, he could just start on the digestion of the other potion, circumventing the problem altogether. Along with that, it also meant that he could act on all the 3 pathways at the same time, boosting the Nov, L, B//JNN digestion speed exponentially. The last 3% of the potion, I can digest it by using the principles of the seer pathway that have already been established by Mr. Fool. Winston smiled in expectation of the future. It seems Sequence 8 will be coming sooner than I expected. Chapter 15, Promotion. Winston spent the rest of the day inside his own room, researching about the tower on the box that he had found out about. At one point, Amon came to look for him, only to be sent back by Winston, who did not wish to be disturbed. And in the end, it turned out to be the right choice, simply because of the sheer amount of information Winston realized that he had lacked before. Jihad, the king of the tower and the 10 great families that ruled under his empire. The top floor of the tower, the 134th floor, and a plethora of other information that he had not realized before. He could engage in conversations about them now. With the newfound knowledge, he was sure he would not appear too much like an oddball out of the regulars. And as he had found out, such a thing would be crucial for his own survival, because he had found out about the existence of similar beings such as himself. Irregulars, as they were called, were beings that come from outside of the tower, opening the gates and stepping inside to climb. They went against the predetermined rules of the tower to rebel against natural order and universal law, climbing the tower even though they had not yet been chosen. Irregulars bring chaos to the tower, marked by great change and times of decadence, to create a whirlpool of destruction and power that pulls in everyone and everything around them, and pushing the fate of every being in the tower to usher in a new age, whether it be one of progression or regression could not be said. There were a variety of examples for the irregulars, the most common being the king of the tower itself and the lower ruling parties, Jihad, and the 10 great families. They were marked as the first batch of irregulars to enter into the tower and propel the administration of the great structure to a new golden age. After which were the other irregulars, Urek Mazino, the founder of Walhaiksong and the 4th-ranked strongest ranker in the entire tower, also hailed as the record holder for the fastest ascent up the tower, a time of 50 years. Then there was Inryu the infamous, also known as the Red Tower. His infamy comes from the time he killed a floor administrator, shooting it down right from the sky like the mortals they rule over, causing chaos to spread over the floor the said guardian held dominion over. And then, the final irregular, presided as the strongest ranker in the entire tower, Phantominum, the killer of Jihad's royal guards. All of them, without exception, were part of the strongest beings in the tower. There was no irregular that could be considered weak, not one. Upon seeing such information, Winston's first instinct was relief that no one had found out about his state. And then, after relief, it was understanding. It was quite clear now why he was able to condense Shinsu into an attacking force so quickly. It was only expected from an irregular. Wait, what about the irregulars that entered before me? Winston contemplated. He distinctly recalled Hedon, the first-floor guardian, saying something along the lines of not receiving such extensive visits in a long time, meaning there had been some people that had entered the tower before him. I can't be sure of the time frame they might have entered before me. It might even have been a few years. At this point, they might already be far ahead of me. Winston nodded, feeling exceedingly sure of his guess. But I can't yet eliminate the possibility that they entered right before me. At the very least, I must be prepared for an encounter with an overwhelmingly powerful opponent. Getting off the chair which he had kept right next to his bed, he stretched his body again. Time to digest the potion now. Thinking about that, he voiced out the main maxims of a seer. A true seer must possess reverence towards fate, he said. Almost immediately, he felt his spirit body churn and twist and bubble up in anticipation of an unknown event yet to come. One must help others seek out and interpret their fates, yet at the same time, constantly maintain fear and respect towards it. A seer does not become egoistical about his abilities to see through the web of fate, nor can he get too prideful and never believe blindly in one's own interpretation of fate. As he said the words, something deep within him bubbled as if put on a hot stove. He felt his core heating up and cooling down rapidly, and felt something deep within him break into its most fundamental forms. And finally, he continued, divination is not all-powerful, he declared. And with that, he felt his spirit body undergo rapid change. something broke down and came together, merging incessantly with his very core being. Ho 000000000, he breathed out, then he stopped. The potion, which had just come to the precipice of digestion, had lacked just a simple push to shove it in the right direction, infinitely close to a complete digestion. Winston closed his eyes, feeling the almost interminable power stored within. As he stood upon the precipice of an inexorable event to come, he felt himself floating like a will-o-wisp, a paper in the wind. With a smile, he declared one of the maxims of the Marauder potion, one he had established just a day prior to give himself the push needed. One must be fast in thought and bold in action. A true marauder takes action only when success can be seen, he declared. And with that, he felt the 3 potions rapidly digesting and fusing with his being, completely overtaking his spirit. Winston felt as if a weight had been thrown off his shoulders, a burden he carried without his knowledge had been put down. That feeling's a bit addicting. He chuckled. Just as he was getting used to the feeling of his potion completely having been digested, he suddenly sensed something. Ads by Pub Future. It was the next potion, comprising the sequence 8 of the Fool, Error, and Door pathways, Clown, Swindler and Trickmaster. Winston's eyes widened in surprise and amazement as he felt the sensation of the potion. It felt like it lied somewhere infinitely far away, yet somehow it surrounded him completely still. It was a surreal sensation. He felt as if he could summon the potion anytime, should he desire to consume it no matter the time. A vicious grin couldn't help but make its way onto Winston's face. Then, he looked at his right hand, which was injured, and tapped his thumb and ring finger twice. The hand was covered in a white color, symbolizing good health. Nodding to himself, he sat down again and took off the covers on his hand. And from under the covers emerged his hand as good as new, seemingly never having been injured to begin with. Seeing that, Winston's eyes turned a bit thoughtful. What is it that's speeding up the healing process? Peering a bit further using his spirit vision, Winston discovered something strange. The waves of Shinsu, little wisps of power, were constantly rushing into his hand, nourishing it from the outside and from the within. Winston understood that the body was a machine that healed constantly. Under the right conditions, any injury could be healed so long as the damage was not permanent. And the Shinsu at the moment seemed to be supplying his hand with the most optimal condition for healing, along with a constant supply of energy to replace the lost cells. Interesting, Winston exclaimed, an excited grin on his face. He took his steel broadsword from the side and overlapped it with a layer of spirituality. Spirituality had a tendency to leak better from sharp edges and places with less surface area. It was a simple application of the principle by which corona discharge happened to electricity. Spirituality spread itself out evenly across a surface once it was applied to it, meaning there is a constant spirituality density at all points that hold similar areas. However, that meant that at the places where the area thins out, the spirituality density increases, allowing it to slide off of itself and leak outside, mimicking the corona discharge phenomenon with electricity. Concentrating, he overlapped the entire room with a layer of spirituality, shielding it from prying eyes and outside interference. He kept the broadsword back where he grabbed it from and sat cross-legged on the bed. Then, he exhaled. Winston extended his hands and willed for the sequence 8 potion to appear before him. And appear it did. There was no burst of light, nor any flashy sound, neither was there any sort of special effect that accompanied it. There it was, empty air. And then, suddenly, a transparent vial of an orange-colored liquid appeared in place. Winston quickly caught the vial just as it appeared, lest it fell to the ground and shattering along with it, his hope to ascend any higher than sequence 9. As he took it in his hand, he gazed at it intently. It was a orange-colored liquid, yellowing at the top. It constantly bubbled and turned inside the vial, as if it was still in the process of concoction. Winston stared at it for a second, then, with resolute eyes, he opened the cap and downed the entire mixture in a single go. He drank the potion and wiped his mouth with his sleeves. Then, he kept aside the vial and waited. It didn't take long, not even a second, that the ascendance to the next sequence began to stir changes in his body. Winston felt his entire body rapidly heat up, reaching approximately 45 degrees Celsius and then cool down just after to almost 2 degrees. It repeated in a cycle, happening over and over and over and over again, all in the span of 2 seconds or less. Then, He suddenly felt his hands, arms, chest, and everywhere else that held skin rapidly fire up with blisters and pores, through which a minute amount of blood began to seam out. Nov. L.B//JNN Winston breathed, nay, whimpered, not screaming out despite his wanting to. Even though the wall of spirituality had been set up, solely because it was the first time he had done it, he decided to not risk the chance of exposing himself and kept quiet. The pain lasted an eternity, or was it a single instant? Winston's entire soul body was turned inside out and his body suddenly turned incredibly flexible. He felt an unscratchable itch inside his ear, one he didn't dare to try. And then, suddenly, it all ended. He felt his skin return to normal and body temperature balance out. The itch in his ear was all but gone at this point and he sat back up. He looked down. Ugh, goddamn, he cried. The blood all over his body had rendered all of his clothes and the mattress of his bed into a crimson mess. He shook his head and analyzed the changes brought on by his promotion. First was the clown, the sequence 8 of the Fool pathway. First and foremost, the most obvious was the physical enhancement brought about by the potion. Besides the slight physical strength and durability increase that one gets at each promotion, Winston had never felt such a transcendent sense of control over his own body before. He felt as if he had control over each and every muscle fiber inside his body, barring certain internal organs like his heart. Besides that, his sense of three-dimensional observation and perception had just shot through the roof, making his balance become increasingly stronger. Winston suddenly jumped off of his bed right from the seating position and landed right on the backrest of the chair he had previously sat on. The chair didn't move an inch, as if nothing had happened to it. Winston stood on top of its thin backrest and stood on a single toe, adopting the stance of a ballet dancer. This is refreshing, he thought offhandedly. Along with that, both his swindler and clown potion further enhanced his dexterity, reaching inhumane levels. And lastly, he looked towards the table where a stack of empty papers were kept. He jumped off the chair and took one in his hand. Then, with a rapid movement from his arm, the paper disappeared with a howling sound of the wind. Whoosh! Winston looked on, seeing the paper pass right through the door of his bathroom. Ads by Pub Future, I probably shouldn't have done that, he mused, but then shrugged his shoulders. Then, he focused onto the error pathway sequence 8, Swindler. He had gained two things from this potion, the first being deception. He had gained the ability to be naturally charming in front of others and be more trustworthy, effortlessly being able to shape the conversation to his liking and mislead other people's thoughts. And then, the second thing he had gained was the minor mastery of illusions to trick and deceive his opponents. He focused on his spirituality and then, a fleeting figure of a man appeared in front of him. It was another Winston? Winston nodded his head with a satisfied smile. Though the illusion was hardly perfect, with it appearing ethereal, seemingly about to disappear at any moment, he felt that it would be extremely useful in combat. In the first place, the illusion ability was not so prominent at this stage. The only reason he was able to create his own image from an illusion was solely due to his spirituality that had been enhanced by all three potions. And then, dispelling the illusion, he moved on to his final potion. The sequence 8 of the door pathway, Trickmaster. As the name implied, the Beyonders of this sequence could utilize a variety of small-scale spells, including but not limited to, creating fog, creating a light burst of wind, creating light, freezing the target, and so on and so forth. Converging his spirituality, Winston felt a breeze blow past his face and scatter the papers kept on the table all over the room. Flutter, flutter, the papers fluttered in the room due to the light gust of wind seemingly coming out of nowhere. Winston popped his neck. The last couple of benefits brought on due to promotion were a combined effect of all of them. Enhanced spirituality, a level which would not be considered natural for any Beyonder currently at sequence 8. In fact, the combined exponential increase of the three pathways was so much that Winston felt like he would have had the equivalent spirituality as Klein at sequence 6. It was incredibly absurd. And then, moving on to his physicals, he felt that he could punch clean through a door. His muscles seemed to be packed with strength and power, ready at a moment's notice. And finally, and most importantly,